Good morning, expert participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is our pleasure to welcome you to this virtual expert group meeting, implementing Beijing Plus 25 commitments in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Srinivas Tata. He is the Director of the Social Development Division at SCAP, to deliver his welcome remarks. Dr. Tata, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chana. Distinguished participants, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, a very warm welcome to this virtual expert group meeting on implementing Beijing Plus 25 commitments, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the new normal. I wish we could have had all of you here in person, but this is what we operate in, and we hope that we'll make the best use of technology in order to reach out to all of you. On behalf of SCAP, I extend my warm gratitude to all of you for your enthusiastic participation in this important event. In fact, we've been quite overwhelmed by your response. We are especially pleased to co-organize this virtual meeting with our strong partners, UN Women, who have been steadfast, who have stood by, who we feel it's a privilege to work with in championing women's equality and empowerment in the Asia-Pacific region and across the globe. This meeting intends to facilitate an exchange of knowledge and good practices and discuss the way forward in the implementation of the Beijing Plus 25 commitments, which were adopted at the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference last November. We hope to draw upon your collective knowledge to produce recommendations for the region to accelerate implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action and the declaration, which has now kind of attained increased urgency in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It may be cliched, but it's good to remind ourselves that the Asia-Pacific region has made good progress in the empowerment of women and girls over the last 25 years. But as they say, much work remains to be done. Further, the progress that we have made is threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, our Secretary General has repeatedly warned us that the devastating social and economic impact on women and girls is reversing the limited and fragile progress on gender equality that the region had made. Some of the areas facing the greatest threat from the pandemic, which we will focus on today, include women's economic empowerment and the elimination of violence against women and girls. Women's economic empowerment still has a long way to go across the Asia-Pacific region. The gap between male and female labor force participation is more than 30%. Furthermore, women's labor force participation on an average has declined since 1995 from 55% in 1995 to 50% in 2018. Women who are employed are more likely to find work in the informal sector with limited access to social protection and other employment benefits. We all know that women continue to bear the brunt of unpaid care work at home. On an average, women spend 4 times more time on unpaid care work than their male counterparts across Asia Pacific. The long hours that women put into unpaid care detracts from their ability to undertake paid work outside the home, limiting them from exploring the full economic potential. Unfortunately, many women and girls in our region continue to experience violence at the hands of intimate partners. Globally, 30% of women on an average suffer this type of violence. In Asia Pacific, this figure ranges from 15% to 68% of women across different countries and subregions. More must be done clearly to ensure safety of women and girls. The COVID-19 pandemic has gendered effects that in large part are attributable to the existing social and economic inequalities that women have long faced. For instance, the incidence of violence against women is reported to be increasing during the pandemic across a range of countries. This is especially true for domestic violence. Women are also at a greater risk of losing their income and livelihoods. The year 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 5-year milestone of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Asia-Pacific Beijing Plus 25 Declaration recognizes and situates women and girls as active agents of change for the region's development and outlines key actions by governments with support of stakeholders to close gender gaps and realize women's rights. In addition to our intergovernmental convenership at ESCAP, we are focusing on 3 key areas in our analytical and capacity development work, which is economic empowerment of women, leadership, and improving gender statistics. On the issue of women's economic empowerment, we recognize that entrepreneurship is a catalyst for women's economic empowerment and sustainable economic growth. Women entrepreneurs face complex barriers that limit their opportunities to start up and grow their business. Such obstacles range from a lack of access to finance and technology to low levels of financial and digital literacy, and also to negative gender stereotypes. ESCAP's Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship Program is addressing such challenges using an ecosystem approach. We're working with governments to improve policies and regulations, with financial institutions and private sector to invest in women entrepreneurs, and to provide more innovative financial and digital solutions. COVID-19 has impacted micro, small, and medium enterprises greatly. ESCAP has been supporting the governments of Cambodia, Vietnam, Fiji, and Samoa to help mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on women-led MSMEs. The second issue that I want to focus on, women's political participation and leadership. Although the share of women in positions of leadership has increased over the past 2 decades, the numbers are very far from reaching gender parity. Women's participation and leadership are critical for sustainable development, and therefore it's important to utilize our regional intergovernmental platform to continuously advocate this issue. Last but not least, I would like to focus on improving data and statistics. There is a lack of gender data to inform decision-making and monitor progress. To improve gender data production and use, ESCAP has developed a policy data integration tool called EPIC, which is essentially every policy is connected to help strengthen national statistical systems. We are, of course, working in close cooperation and collaboration with member states, civil society, and other stakeholders, and above all, with our key partners, UN agencies, especially UN Women, in our endeavor. And you will see a real improvement in our statistics work along in partnership with UN Women. We are, of course, working in close cooperation and with everyone, and we look forward to suggestions from you how we can then sharpen the support that we are offering member states. I wish you the most fruitful of dialogues and look forward to your insightful inputs and recommendations for the implementation of the Asia Pacific Declaration on Gender Equality over the next 5 years. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tata, for these warm welcome remarks. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Sarah Knips, Deputy Regional Director of UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Knips, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Srinivas Tata, Director of the Social Development Division of UNESCAP and this meeting's co-convener, distinguished delegates from government, civil society, academia, and the private sector, UN colleagues, dear participants. I'm really honored to join you this morning on behalf of the UN Women Regional Director for Asia and Pacific, Mohammed Nasiri. Thank you all for committing your time to participate in this virtual expert group meeting. This gathering builds on the momentum of the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on the Beijing +25 Review, which was held in November 2019, and which adopted the Asia-Pacific Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. Over the next 2 days, we look forward to an exchange of knowledge and good practice, building on all of your significant and valuable experience to develop recommendations of priority actions to advance the implementation of the Declaration. Exactly 25 years ago today, at the conclusion of the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, the global community adopted the Beijing Platform for Action. This is a bold agenda for the transformation needed to realize the human rights of women and girls. This was an extraordinary moment in the struggle for gender equality. However, in spite of the activism of grassroots women and the hard-won gains of women working for change in the public policy sphere and in their private lives, no country in the world has yet achieved gender equality. Systemic barriers to equality persist, and they require transformative approaches and new alliances that engage governments, the women's movement, and the private sector. Earlier this year, UN Women published a major stock-taking report, which showed that progress towards gender equality is faltering and hard-won advances are already being reversed. These worrying trends are made more acute by the current COVID-19 pandemic. As Dr. Tata has already outlined for us, the pandemic is exacerbating existing inequalities and threatening to reverse gains. The impacts of COVID-19 on women and girls include lost incomes and livelihoods, with a recent UN Women and UNDP report reflecting that the pandemic is expected to push as many as 47 million girls and women below the poverty line. We know that women are also facing increased violence at this time, including intimate partner violence in the domestic sphere, sexual abuse, exploitation, and cyber violence. Women both work in the front line of the COVID response while also bearing the brunt of increased increased unpaid domestic and care work in the home. In some countries and sub-regions, including some in our own region, pandemic impacts are compounded by climate-related challenges such as cyclones, flooding, and mudslides. And in other contexts, we see the challenges to the exercise of fundamental freedoms, limiting the space for civil society and for women human rights defenders. Like other institutions that are represented here today, UN Women has been working with our partners, governments, academia, civil society, UN partners, and the private sector to respond to the pandemic. This has included increased efforts to collect data and to support evidence-based programmatic interventions, to address pandemic impacts in line with the UN framework for the immediate socioeconomic response to COVID-19, which was launched in April. So our meeting today is a very important opportunity to review some key regional data points on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on specific gender-related indicators, including those around SDG 5. It's also an opportunity to share experience and to discuss the status of women's rights across a number of interrelated areas. I hope we can also begin to examine how our responses to the pandemic, from the humanitarian response to economic stimulus packages to reinventions of working life and our efforts to create solidarity across social and physical distance, how all of these can be turned into opportunities to build back better for girls and women. Distinguished participants, the upcoming UN General Assembly will provide a key opportunity to bring to the forefront the continuing relevance of the Beijing Platform for Action and to move the needle on implementation. Global leaders will come together for a high-level meeting on accelerating the realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls on the 1st of October. This event will aim to reinforce the message that building equality and inclusive societies is more urgent and desperately needed than ever. As you are all aware, urgent action is needed to address policy and legislative gaps that allow inequalities in both opportunities and outcomes. This includes reviewing national policies and laws and looking into how they can and should address attitudes and social norms that structure power relations that are embedded in patterns of gender inequality, gender discrimination, and patriarchy. It also means prioritizing financing to ensure the implementation of much needed measures, including through gender transformative economic stimulus packages and social protection measures in response to COVID-19. Over the next 2 days, we hope that ourselves and all of you will benefit from the shared experience and expertise to define key recommendations for the acceleration of the implementation of the Asia-Pacific Declaration on actions that we can take to safeguard and build on the hard-won gains on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. It's very important that this gathering brings together women and men from different sectors, countries, expertise, and life experiences. Diverse voices are important because the experience of the last 25 years has underlined that effective measures to realize women's human rights need to be framed intersectionally, taking account of the different experiences women and girls face as a result of race, age, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability, among other factors. I'd like to close by thanking you once again for joining this discussion virtually. We so much appreciate you being here with us. We very much look forward to hearing your ideas on how we can work together effectively to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in Asia Pacific. We wish everyone a productive discussion. And thank you once again to our partners in ESCAP. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Tata and Ms. Knips for these cogent opening remarks, and a warm welcome to everyone to our virtual expert group meeting, Implementing Beijing +25 Commitments in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss our commitments to gender equality and the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Today we have with us a large number of experts and professionals working to make Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality and the Beijing +25 declaration a reality. We have government representatives and policymakers, civil society representatives, private sector representatives, and colleagues from UN agencies, funds, and programs from across Asia and the Pacific. The objectives of the virtual expert group meeting are twofold. First, to facilitate the exchange of knowledge, good practices, and lessons learned with respect to the progressive implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. What has the pandemic meant for the region's progress in gender equality? And second, to develop key recommendations for priority actions to advance the implementation of the Asia-Pacific Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, which was adopted in the November 2019 Ministerial Conference. Together, we will discuss different dimensions of inclusive and sustainable social development, namely the socio-economic, political, and environmental components. We will have 5 sessions over the span of 2 days and will conclude this expert group meeting with a key set of recommendations for our path forward. The outcome of this meeting will also inform the work of ESCAP and UN Women in supporting Asia-Pacific countries in implementing our gender commitments. Next slide, please. The virtual EGM will consist of 5 sessions. We will hear from experts of different topics and discuss recommendations for going forward. The first session will introduce the outcome of the Asia-Pacific Beijing +25 review through presentations on the declaration, and will place the subsequent discussions within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The following sessions will address key gender issues. Session 2 will focus on women's economic empowerment, Session 3 on addressing violence against women, and Session 4 on women and environmental sustainability. All sessions will integrate perspectives on the overall socio-economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on women and girls, including the ways in which the pandemic has exacerbated the disproportionate amount of unpaid care and domestic works, translated into lost livelihoods and incomes, especially within informal work, and increased incidences of violence against women and girls. The objective of the final session, session 5, will be to articulate these key recommendations. And please note that we will begin our meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thailand Standard Time. That is half an hour earlier than today. Next slide, please. Before we begin today's session, a few housekeeping announcements. These have also been entered into the chat box. So while we encourage your active participation in the discussions, please do turn your camera off and mute your microphone when not speaking. Please also refer to the technical note that was circulated in advance of the meeting for further details. To facilitate your participation in the session discussions and to ensure other participants the opportunity to engage effectively, we would kindly request that you use the Zoom chat function during the session presentations to write in any comments, questions that you may have or wish to flag for the attention of the session moderator, indicating if to one of the speakers to whom the question or comment is being addressed. And we kindly request you that you make your questions, comments brief and succinct, and that you include your full name and affiliation, please. So in view of the limited time for this meeting and the large number of participants, we kindly ask for your understanding that all participants may not be able to take the floor. Rest assured, however, that all your questions and commentaries submitted in the chat box will be considered both for the attention of the moderators and speakers' attention during the sessions, as well as in the meeting report that we will issue after the meeting. Finally, towards the end of day 2, we will also share a link to our evaluation in the chat box, and we would very much appreciate you taking your time to complete this short questionnaire. Next slide, please. Again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to working together and continuing this important discussion. We will now move to session 1. This session will introduce the framework of the Beijing Declaration through a number of presentations. And I will now hand over the floor to Ms. Chai Chai, Chief of SCAP's Gender Equality and Social Inclusion section, to moderate this first session. Ms. Chai Chai, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shanae. Ladies and gentlemen, since 1995, gender equality has become central to the realization of inclusive and sustainable global development. And women's empowerment was integrated into the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals with a dedicated goal on gender equality. While we have seen lots of progress, recent reviews of BPFA show that many challenges remain. It has been a long journey towards gender equality and the empowerment of women. We still have a long road ahead. So Hoda will be playing the slides, and now we move to the next slides. I want to just briefly mention more than 600 participants from 54 countries attended the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference last November. The conference resulted in the adoption of the Asia Pacific Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. It is a comprehensive set of commitments and actions on region-specific issues that can move forward the gender equality agenda over the next 5 years. The Beijing +25 Declaration calls government and other actors to intensify actions to realize gender equality. These actions are clustered around the 6 thematic areas, including equitable and inclusive development, poverty reduction, social protection, freedom from violence, participation, social dialogue, accountability, as well as the important role of national women's machinery for gender equality. Peaceful and inclusive societies, highlighting women's role as active change agents. And the last thematic areas, environmental conservation, climate change, and resilience building. In addition, the declaration highlighted the importance of data and statistics, as well as partnerships and regional cooperation. While the region is gearing up to implement these commitments, in the past 8 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened and amplified existing inequalities and threatens to undo the progress made in poverty reduction and gender equality. So in the first session, we'd like to consider broad questions. What can be done to ensure strengthened commitments to implement the Beijing Platform for Action and the Beijing +25 review outcomes, taking into consideration of the context of the ongoing COVID pandemic. So now I want to just, as you can see on the slides, we have an amazing panel of speakers, of women leaders, advocates, and practitioners from government, UN, and civil society for this first session. I also want to mention briefly the outline for session 1. Move to the next slide, please. We will start with presentation from our 5 panelists. Each presenter has 8 minutes. I have to request all speakers please keep to this time limit. And we will hear from our speakers on their take on Beijing +25 review and the impact of COVID-19 and how it affects SDG 5. And then we will have about 30 minutes scheduled for discussion. I want to suggest our discussion could be guided by the following questions. Let me share with you these guiding questions while our speakers present their perspectives. So this leaves you some time for digestion and perhaps thinking around these questions. First question, what should be the next step in realizing the goals set in the Beijing +25 Declaration? What is needed to turn this commitment into action at different levels, regional, sub-regional, national, and local? Second question, we are only a decade away from 2030. As evidence suggests, the Asia-Pacific region is unlikely to achieve the SDGs by 2030 without accelerated action? What should be accelerated action look like? Third question. The COVID-19 pandemic is threatening to undo decades of progress made in some areas. What can member states, the UN, and the CSO do to ensure continuous advancement in gender equality and women's empowerment? Finally, partnerships and collaboration are central to both the 2030 Agenda and the Beijing Plus 25 Declaration. Are there some examples of effective partnerships and collaboration from the Asia-Pacific region? Okay, so this is a brief introduction for this session. Before I invite the panelists to take the floor, I would like to emphasize, for any questions and comments, please use the Zoom chat function. The Secretariat is taking note of your inputs. With that, now I'm pleased to invite our first panelist, Ms. Emily Vicati. She's the Divisional Women's Interest Officer, Ministry of Women, Children, and Poverty Alleviation from Fiji. While Emily is a civil servant with the government, she had worked with NGOs with rich experience in community-based and hospital-based social work, and she enjoyed working closely with women at the community level. Emily, please share your perspectives about the Beijing Plus 25 review and Fiji's experience. Over to you, Emily. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Dear participants, Mbula Vinaka and warm greetings from Fiji. On behalf of the Minister for Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation, the Honorable Mariseni Vuniwanga, and our Permanent Secretary, Ms. Jennifer Poole, and our Director Women, Ms. Selai Korvusere, I would like to present our take on the Asia-Pacific Declaration on Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. Just to draw you to what I will be presenting briefly is before you. Just present a short context and background on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. On the second point, Beijing Plus 25 review outcomes, the summary of key achievements, summary of key challenges, and the key actions that are outlined in the Asia-Pacific Declaration. Also, on the fourth point, we'd like to add Fiji context on the gendered impacts of COVID-19. Thank you. Next slide, please. 25 years ago, some 50,000 women and men from 189 countries arrived in Beijing, China, for the Fourth World Conference on Women, determined to recognize the rights of women and girls as human rights. The conference culminated in the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most comprehensive policy agenda for the empowerment of women. In Beijing, we dreamt that the daily life of all women and girls would be radically transformed, that girls in the future would be born in a world full of opportunities where they could learn and grow, that every woman and girl could lead a life free from all forms of violence and oppression, with access to education, healthcare, decent work, and decision-making at all levels. These dreams were put on paper and became global agreements that we expected would be translated into reality. In the years following, women and girls pressed these dreams and agenda forward, leading local, regional, and global movements on issues ranging from economic empowerment to ending violence against women and girls, from sexual and reproductive health rights, climate justice, and equal pay. And no doubt that we are shaking the pillars of patriarchy. And as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, a lot has been done. Every 5 years since 1995, progress in achieving the strategic objectives has been reviewed by the Commission on Status of Women. And we are here now, fast forward to 2020. Let's see, next slide, please. Yes, as we look back, much has been achieved globally, and for us in the region, such transformations indeed were advanced by the Beijing Agenda, and more importantly, by the enormous work of women's rights organizations. However, we all observe that progress has been slow, and persisting patterns of inequality are stalling further progress on gender equality. As a result, member states were called upon to undertake national level reviews of the progress made and challenges that were encountered in the implementation of the Declaration and Platform for Action. Thus, the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference was convened on the 27th to 29th of November 2019 in attendance of more than 600 participants, 54 countries and 166 civil society organizations. Member states then adopted the Asia-Pacific Declaration on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. So these, the culmination of a comprehensive set of commitments and actions on region-specific issues that can see the acceleration on the progress towards gender equality over the next 5 years. Also historical for us in Fiji was when our Minister for Women, the Honorable Meriseni Vuniwanga, was elected as chair of the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference. And so this was a first for Fiji and also for the Pacific region. Next slide, please. I shall now take us through the outcomes of the Beijing Plus 25 review and the key achievements. As we can see, there are 5 groups that are before you. And these were the list that the Asia Pacific countries had come up with on the achievements for the past 5 years. Excuse me, and you can see the first is adoption of laws, regulations, action plan and policies, women's economic empowerment, improvement of women's political participation and decision-making power, the presence of national gender machinery, and data and statistics. I shall briefly mention or highlight some key achievements along each of the 5 groups that you have before you. For the first, in terms of the adoption of laws, 63% of countries in the review identified the adoption of laws, regulations, action plans, and policies as one of the key achievements over the review period. 33 countries have a current gender strategy or national action plan on gender equality, and 47 countries have ratified CEDAW. To the second, on women's economic empowerment, 63% of the countries have reported the advancement of WE as one of their key achievements. Despite the falling participation rates of women in the labor force and rising informality, countries have strengthened legislative measures with regard to equality in the workplace, developed laws and policies and programs to achieve work-life balance. And also women's entrepreneurship is seen as a pathway towards WE. In terms of the third group on improved participation, improvement of women's political participation, one of the key achievements was that 49% of the countries in the review identified the improvement of women's participation and decision-making. 4 countries in the region achieving more than 30% in national parliamentary representation. And I'd like to mention for Fiji, women's representation in parliament has increased from 16 to 20%, of which 23% hold cabinet positions, which consists of 3 ministers and 2 assistant ministers. Just an example. Then I shall go on to the 4th group, where all countries in the review have reported the presence of national gender machinery. And for 28 countries, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls are key priorities in national plans or strategies for achieving the SDGs. Though 2 countries did not consider these, and 4 countries in the region did not have a national strategy or action plan for achieving the goals during the review. The 5th grouping on data and statistics. Countries have made the most progress in producing knowledge products on gender statistics, conducting new surveys to produce national baseline information on gender-related topics. Data are a key means of implementation of the 2030 Agenda, whereby 12 countries identified that still data gaps are a key impediment to the advancement of gender equality in the region. Next slide, please. In terms of the key challenges, there were 3 key challenges that were outlined in the review. The first was the barriers to women's economic participation. The second, gender norms and stereotypes. And third, the lack of gender capacities in implementing gender equality policies, plans, and programs. I would just like to add on and highlight some key challenges according to those groupings. For the first one, 49% of the countries noted that the difficulties of navigating the future terrain of work presented a key challenge in the region. Technological challenges, climate change, and demographic shifts are forces that are changing the landscape of work. For example, in 5 member countries of the ASEAN Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, namely Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, it was found that women were more likely than men to be employed in an occupation at high risk of automation and were therefore more susceptible to losing their jobs. In terms of gender norms and stereotypes, 41% of the countries reported that the translation of policies, plans, and programs into concrete actions was being stifled by adverse gender norms and stereotypes. Countries noted the need to raise the awareness and understanding of parliamentarians, public service employees, and the public more broadly. The third grouping, 41% of the countries noted a lack of capacity among individuals and entities responsible for implementing gender equality policies, plans, and programs. Next slide, please. Just briefly, the 8 actions that are broadly clustered under the overarching dimensions. These has been previously alluded by our speakers, but would just like to present that the declaration calls upon governments in Asia and the Pacific, with the support of all relevant stakeholders as appropriate, to intensify actions to realize women's equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms for an equal future by 2030. So just presented before you are the 8 key actions that are highlighted in the Asia Pacific Declaration on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. Next slide, please. At this point, I would like to share the gendered impacts of COVID-19 in the Fiji context. This is an infographic that was part of a research conducted by the working group in Fiji that was formed in response to COVID-19. The working group comprised of Diverse Voices in Action, Diva for Equality in Fiji, Fiji Women's Rights Movement, UN Women, Fiji Multi-Country Office, the Asian Development Bank, and led by the Ministry of Women. As we can see in this infographic, as I would just like to highlight, that the Fijian government recognizes the gendered impact of COVID-19 and is prioritizing the importance of gender-responsive national recovery plans in fighting the effects. In Fiji, as elsewhere, the economic impacts of COVID-19 are being disproportionately felt by women who earn less than men, have less saved, and work in jobs with little security or protection. These preconditions, coupled with increased unpaid work from additional caring responsibilities and spikes in already high rates of gender-based violence, as we can see in the infographics, whereby 2 out of 3 women in Fiji are being subjected to physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. The socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on Fijian women and girls will continue well beyond the immediate health crisis. The government of Fiji believes firmly that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable among us. The COVID-19 pandemic brought to our attention the importance and urgency of taking social protection to informal workers, and in particular building resilience for near poor households who are just above the poverty cutoff, and all women and girls and marginalized groups, whilst also supporting micro and small enterprises. This means looking towards broadening our disaster crisis responsive social protection interventions or targets. So we are at present examining the possibility to do so with a human-centered, all women and girls-centered agenda. We are looking into best practices, lessons learned from other countries, and also innovative, inclusive, transformative models to decide what could work for our small island nation. This course of action could prompt 1, development of a national social protection policy framework with an embedded gender transformative disaster resilience responsive component. 2nd, rollout of policy-oriented pilot targeted initiatives, and also the Partnership for Greater Transformative Disaster Risk and Resilience Building, Financing and Support. I thank you all for your attention, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and Vinakabalevo.
Many thanks, Emily, for your excellent and comprehensive overview of the Beijing Plus 25 review outcomes. And also, it's excellent for all of us to see that how Fiji integrate gender into the national response to COVID-19. Thank you very much. So now we have 4 more speakers on the panel. I would like to ask everyone to stick to the 8 minutes limit for your presentation so that we can keep some time for discussion. Okay, now I would like to invite Ms. Christine Rosary Yuvong Chavs, who is the Executive Director for Philippine Commission on Women. Okay, hold on. Edie Cree, hold on, just sorry for the pause. I want to just briefly mention that Edie Cree, as she's called by many, is a mother, lawyer, business professional, and a women's rights advocate. Her passion to advance women's rights is closely connected with her legal profession. As a lawyer, she handled pro bono cases on violence against women and children and advocated for the gender-sensitive policies, women's entrepreneurship, and protection of women against sexual harassment in the workplace. Edie Cree, please share your reflections. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the Philippines. Next slide, please. 2020 is a pivotal year for the accelerated realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Aside from the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, it is also the 5th-year implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. However, in this milestone year, we are instead experiencing a global pandemic that threatens the hard-fought gains achieved towards gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. It is this extremely challenging landscape that we must press on to accomplish the full implementation of the BPFA and Sustainable Development Goals. Next, please. In the past 5 years, significant achievements have been made in the Philippines for women and girls across the overarching dimensions of the BPFA. It is apparent, however, that the COVID-19 pandemic has and will continue to slow down the progress we have made in these areas and has simultaneously caused unprecedented challenges for women and girls everywhere. Allow me to discuss how the Philippines has accelerated progress of the BPFA and how we expect the ongoing crisis to affect the implementation of identified priority areas for action in healthcare, education, economic participation, social protection, political participation and representation, including in peace processes and environmental conservation, and eliminating violence against women and girls. Next, please. An overarching dimension 1, policies on decent work, business and entrepreneurship have improved working conditions of women in the informal and formal sectors and of women migrant workers, such as the expanded maternity leave law, Handbook for Overseas Filipino Workers Act, Domestic Workers Act, and Go Negosyo or Go Business Act. For women farmers, specialized capacity building and provision of production inputs, including women-friendly equipment and post-harvest facilities, have helped improve agricultural productivity. The Philippines has also supported programs and services to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care and domestic work. COVID-19 has immobilized both the formal and informal economies, with women in the informal sector, migrant workers, and micro-entrepreneurs among the hardest hit. Lockdowns and school closures have put additional strain on women working at home as they carry an already disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work. Prevailing high income inequality may be exacerbated, and informal workers are at risk of being left behind in social amelioration programs. Next, please. An overarching dimension 2, next please. Thank you. To promote displaced and disadvantaged women's access to decent work, livelihood, and emergency employment programs were implemented from 2014 to 2019, including for returning women migrant workers. Women micro-entrepreneurs, who comprise the majority of MSMEs in the Philippines, were provided financial and mentorship support. The Philippines also strengthened its conditional transfer program to be more inclusive and comprehensive and introduced unconditional transfers for more indigent beneficiaries. Strong legislation on healthcare and sexual and reproductive health and rights, such as the Universal Healthcare Act, Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act, Attaining and Sustaining Zero Unmet Need for Modern Family Planning and First 100 Days Law, has increased access to health services for women and girls. Next, please. The updating of K-12 curriculum to meet comprehensive sexual education standards and implementation of free, technical and vocational education and training for universal access to quality education have resulted in improved educational outcomes and skills for women and girls. Presently, services and facilities meant for sexual and reproductive health care are at risk of being deprioritized as the number of COVID-19 cases continue to rise. It is imperative that sexual and reproductive health care services continue to be provided to women and girls despite quarantine and isolation measures in place. Another major challenge for the country is the continuation of education for learners at all levels in a safe and accessible manner through strategies such as blended and remote learning. Next, please. On overarching dimension 3, notable policies on eliminating violence against women and girls were enacted, including the Anti-Mail Order Spouse Act and Safe Spaces Act, established committees on anti-trafficking and anti-VAUSI, development of a strategic action plan against trafficking, collaborative action with youth and civil society organizations, and continuous awareness campaigns have contributed to combating gender-based violence and abuse and has helped the Philippines maintain its Tier 1 ranking in the 2020 Trafficking in Persons report. Next, please. An overarching dimension 4, Programs have been implemented to improve women's and girls' access to information and communication technologies, especially in rural and remote areas where only 60% of women have access to the internet. The Philippines and other partners launched the Women ICT Frontier Initiative and the Women Empowerment ICT that aim to empower Filipinos with strong economic and digital literacy skills. Access to technology is especially important now more than ever in the new normal where digital methods are favored over physical interactions. Women and girls in rural and remote areas are at higher risk of falling further behind in terms of availing social services, especially health and education, as they have the least resources and access to technology. Next, please. An overarching Dimension 5, the Philippines developed the third generation of its National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security for 2017 to 2022, broadening the framework for addressing the situation of women in armed conflict and their contributions to conflict transformation. Additionally, the country supported women's participation in the peace process, such as that of hijab troopers, and Professor Miriam Coronel Ferrer, the chief negotiator of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, the first and only female chief negotiator in the world that signed a major peace agreement. Currently, we have an undertaking with UN Women Philippines to conduct the mapping of gender issues and concerns facing the frontline peace and security duty bearers in this time of COVID-19. The objectives are to explore the current and potential gender dimensions of COVID-19 at the perspective of the frontline duty bearers, the peace and security personnel, and to highlight the ways in which women, girls, and other marginalized people are affected by the mitigation and response efforts of the government as observed by the frontliners while on duty. Next, please. On Overarching Dimension 6, the Philippines implemented programs to expand the role of women and youth in shaping environmental protection, alongside issuances of policies for disaster risk reduction, climate resilience and mitigation with gender perspectives, such as the Green Jobs Act, enhanced national greening program, and training for women on geological hazards map reading. We recognize that COVID-19 has created new challenges for environmental protection and climate change in the country, with the increase in non-biodegradable and infectious waste from PPE use and medical facilities. We will continue to consider possible ways to mitigate the negative effects of the pandemic on our land and oceans. Next, please. Achieving universal health care, inclusive social protection, decent work, women's economic empowerment, quality education, and eliminating VAUSI have acquired newfound urgency amidst the pandemic. COVID-19 has exacerbated existing inequalities in our society and will have long-lasting adverse effects on the lives of women, children, and other vulnerable groups, unless governments do not actively consider their needs in COVID-19 response and recovery. 25 years after the adoption of the BPFA, the Philippines is both honored and committed to remain a part of the conversation on its full and effective implementation, especially in the context of emerging challenges such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Edie Cree, for your excellent presentation. And what I think is truly amazing is that you have outlined the key actions by the Philippines in the 6 thematic areas very nicely outlining almost all the actions taken and reflecting how the outcomes of Beijing Plus 25 review are being implemented in the Philippines. I think it's a remarkable example. And also, I think the way you have blended the responses of Philippines in terms of addressing gender concerns in the context of the COVID-19 crisis give us the confidence that it's possible to turn the crisis into opportunities for continuously promoting gender equality. Thank you, Edie Cree. Now, let me move on to my UN colleague, Ms. Sarah Dutu Valero. She's a regional advisor on gender statistics from UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Sarah manages the flagship initiative entitled Making Every Woman and Girl Count. And she provides technical support to enhance the quality, availability, and the use of gender statistics across Asia and the Pacific. So at this session, Sarah will share with us the research findings on the gender impact of COVID-19. Sarah, please.
Thank you so much, Tai Tai, and thank you so much to all ESCAP colleagues for inviting us to be here today. And thank you all for connecting online. So it's really nice to be here. So I'll just jump straight into the results of Unlocking the Lockdown, which is a publication that we recently put out to assess the consequences of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So as all of you know, COVID-19 got to Asia first. So soon after the pandemic was declared, we started wondering, like, how is this going to affect men and women differently? So we started thinking, you know, are women and men losing their jobs? Are people spending more time teaching their children now that everybody's staying at home? Are the vulnerable groups getting poorer, or are women and men protected by health insurance? So we wanted answers to all these questions. And that's why we decided to launch a wide-ranging survey. Next slide, please. So in order to make sure that we had full control over our survey and that we could keep the confidentiality of our data, we designed our own survey interface. So we programmed our own survey, also because this allowed us to create pretty sophisticated questionnaire logic. And then we partnered with mobile network operators across the region to launch the survey through text message. Why text message? Because that allowed us to keep control for samples and apply statistical weights afterwards. And then once people received the text message and filled out the survey, the data would go into our own database, again, keeping full confidentiality of the whole of all the results and keeping ownership of the whole survey process. Next, please. So really, our survey targeted random samples of men and women phone users across the region. We ended up having between 1,000 and 8,000 responses per country. So those are pretty large samples. And because we had control over our samples, we were able to apply weights to adjust our samples for sex, age, and educational attainment differentials. The questions and classifications in our questionnaire were in line with international statistical standards for sake of comparability. And the SMS distribution in some countries was complemented with voice or face-to-face surveys for areas that were a little bit remote and where maybe not as many women would have access to phones. And we did this, like I said, in partnership with national governments, the private sector, and other international organizations in select countries. So if you would ask me what's the key finding from our survey, I would probably tell you that COVID-19 may be putting the achievement of the 2030 agenda at stake in Asia and the Pacific, especially for women and girls. So our survey was really multidisciplinary, and we saw effects in every single one of the goals for women and girls. So today we don't have time to go through each of the goals, so I'll just speak into some of the key results. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, this is about health. So because COVID-19 is first and foremost a health emergency, right? But what we see typically from health data is that more men are dying than women, which is true. But we often forget to look at things such as mental health. So when we actually look at mental health, we see that in all the countries across the region, women's mental health is worse than men's as a result of COVID-19. So women are suffering higher rates of stress and anxiety. And this is particularly true for younger women, so women younger than 25 years old. When you look at physical health, we also see that women, since the spread of COVID-19, have had more physical health issues. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they caught the virus, but just any physical health related issues. But this is very relevant because when we ask people whether they're able to see a doctor, we also see that women are having more challenges seeing a doctor since the spread of COVID-19, waiting longer hours at the doctor, and having more challenges purchasing medical supplies. So significant challenges. Next slide, please. We also ask a number of questions around unpaid care and domestic work. And we saw that since the pandemic, everybody's kind of stuck at home, and therefore the domestic and care workload has increased substantially. So when we ask people whether they spend more time, everybody reported increases, both men and women. However, we see that women overall are reporting more increases than men in both unpaid care and domestic work. So this is on top of the fact that women were already doing 4 times as much unpaid care and domestic work than men globally, and they're still reporting more increases. And the differences are particularly noticeable when we ask people whether they're doing at least 3 related activities to unpaid care and domestic work. There's where we see the bigger gaps. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, like I said, is obviously affecting the social dimensions of sustainable development, like we have seen, but it's also affecting the economic and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. So in our survey, we see that 23% of the people told us that their water source had been compromised since the spread of COVID-19. So this is pushing people to find different water sources, which may be further or maybe more difficult to access. And we see that both men and women are reporting increases in time spent collecting water and firewood since the spread of COVID-19. There are differences by sex, but in some countries, it's women that are spending more time, and in some countries, it's men that are spending more time. Next slide, please. And obviously, we see that COVID-19 has had significant consequences on the labor market. So what we see very clearly is that people in formal jobs are working less hours, and we're seeing reductions in paid from formal jobs. And this is particularly true for women. So women may have to maybe take care of the children at home, may have to maybe perhaps are not able to take public transit to go to work, etc. So they are seeing significant reductions in paid work time. When it comes to informal jobs, then both men and women are losing their jobs. When we look at the regional aggregates for all of Asia and the Pacific, we say that women are losing their jobs a little bit faster than men in informal jobs, but there are differences by country. Next slide, please. People in cities are facing also significant challenges, a bit different from people in rural areas. So when we look at, for instance, whether people have found disruptions in public transit, women in capital cities are more likely to say that the disruptions in public transit have affected them as compared to men. Women are also noting that their health routines are being affected as a result of the lockdowns, etc. Next slide, please. And then I'll be remiss if we didn't talk about the shadow pandemic, so violence against women. So because our survey was multidisciplinary, we didn't ask specific questions about violence against women, because for women who are at home with their abusers, this would have put their safety at stake. So this slide here comes from a separate survey that was run among civil society organizations, service providers for victims of violence. So this doesn't come from the victims themselves. But we see that for about 40% of the respondents, they say that they have received more cases of violence from family members since the spread of the virus, followed closely by violence from employers. So a lot of perhaps domestic workers that are confined at home, etc. And this is particularly worrisome because many of the organizations, so 71% of the civil society organizations, service providers, said that they're now operating only partially, and 12% said that they have suspended the service completely. So again, this is quite worrisome. So I'll leave it at that. If you want to see the results across all the goals, next slide, please, then you can find more in the link that's included here. and on UN Women's Data Hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your very succinct yet informative presentation with concrete. We talked a lot about gender impact, and you really bring the data and give us clear evidence on how it impacts livelihood, job security, health, social well-being of women. Thank you. This lays a good foundation for our further discussion, not only for this session and for the entire meeting. Really appreciate it. So now I have the pleasure to invite Ms. Gita Sen to make her intervention. Perhaps most of you know Gita, who is a veteran and a gender champion. She has worked for 35 years on population policies, reproductive and sexual health, gender equality, and women's human rights, as well as broad issues concerning poverty, human development, and the labor markets. And she is a distinguished professor and director with the Public Health Foundation of India, and adjunct professor of global health and population at Harvard University. She's also, perhaps you all know, the general coordinator of DAWN and member of the independent accountability panel for the UN SDGs strategy on every woman, every child, every adolescent. So now we will invite Gita to share her views on key drivers to accelerate gender equality in the UN Decade of Action. Gita, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chai Chai. Let me also thank, through you, UNSGAP and UN Women for giving me the opportunity to present some remarks in this meeting. Good morning, colleagues and friends. Good afternoon to those who are further east than where I am. In this strange time of the pandemic, we've seen very quickly that advances towards gender equality in our region are real, but limited, and also built on all too flimsy foundations. Why do I say this? Before I go to that, let me just put in a couple of caveats to that. I was delighted to hear the previous presentations, everything from the mention of EPIC, Every Policy is Connected, by Dr. Tata, the sophistication of the UN Women's Survey, to hear the Fiji Ministry's speaker, Emily, emphasize social protection for women, to hear the Philippines speaker from the Commission on Women emphasize the interconnections with sexual and reproductive health and rights. All of these tell us that not only in the practice of policies, but in our thinking as well, towards the interconnections of gender equality, we've made significant progress. And yet, our foundations are still relatively fragile. And I will say why that is the case and argue that the pandemic has really shown us a few things about where we critically need to build and strengthen. There were a couple of reasons that the Beijing Platform for Action 25 years ago was so path-breaking. One of them was its basis in human rights. Human rights were not just one of the 12 critical areas of concern, but in fact, the connecting tissue for all 12. Without a rights-based approach, it was clear that our actions, our policies would be narrow and limited. And that connective tissue, in fact, linked not only the 12 critical areas of concern, but linked the Beijing Platform for Action to Rio, Vienna, and Cairo that preceded the Beijing conference, and the UN Social Development Conference that followed Beijing, not to mention Habitat. It's very important that we retain our links through this connecting tissue, because otherwise our advances can be fragile. The second critical reason is that as much as we've tried to advance in the region, one of our problems towards reducing gender inequality and advancing women's human rights, we've been a little bit in the position of trying to mop the floor with the faucet, the tap turned fully on. And that faucet has been the faucet of rising economic inequality in the region, which makes for a very toxic combination with pre-existing and long-standing social inequalities of gender, of caste, of ethnicity and race, of LGBTI status, disability status. There's a range of social inequalities that continue to exist in our region and make for a toxic combination when they are combined with rising social and economic inequality. Those two huge challenges, I think, remain with us. And they are the reason why our advances face so many barriers and why they are limited. Let me just say how I think the pandemic has shown us these limitations. Previous speakers have emphasized some of this, and so I will just very quickly highlight them. The fact that weak health systems prior to the pandemic combined with socioeconomic inequality to make health services much more limited. The reduction in access to maternal health services, adolescent health services, child health services, as well as SRHR services, including access to safe abortion services, all point to the fact that if we don't work towards long-term strengthening of health services, we cannot in fact make progress in these areas that will be sustained. This is true not just for health services, but when we look at all of the 12 areas of concern of Beijing, education, access, and so on. The second one is that within health services, women health workers tend to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. That means when it comes to access to PPE, and one of the things that is emerging now is that women health workers may have access to PPEs, but when policy programs don't pay attention to the fact that a PPE equipment takes as much as 45 minutes to put on. And when a woman may be menstruating, that becomes a nightmare. And so women are challenged in this way in ways that we are not adequately recognizing. Menstrual health for adolescents and women is a critical aspect of their ability to work and participate fully in the workplace. The third is that, and many speakers have mentioned this, women are heavily present as informal workers and migrant workers. And this is, in terms of policies and how we address them, is a kind of, now you see them, now you don't. And all too often, the challenges faced by informal and migrant workers have been far too invisible in the region. And the fourth and fifth, which I won't emphasize because many speakers have, is the rising responsibility for unpaid care work and the silent epidemic of violence against women. What does this mean for us in terms of where we go in the next decade? One is human rights and inequality have to be central to how we think about epic policies, the larger context of policies, whether it is macroeconomic, fiscal, and tax justice policies, or whether it is policies towards sectors other than the ones that we traditionally think of as being women transformative or women responsive. Second, intersectional inequality and the role of intersectional inequality. We need to directly address the challenges of intersectional inequality for work and survival and for participation. The third is the critical importance of gender norms. And here we need to think about the role of older women and of boys. We've paid a lot of attention to girls and girls particularly in changing gender norms. We haven't paid enough attention to the role of older women in reinforcing unequal gender norms. In this context, policies are not all. We know that Beijing +25 faces some critical institutional and funding challenges. The funding challenges have pushed gender institutions and gender policies into the arms of the private for-profit sector without adequate controls, regulations, and sometimes even understanding of the implications for gender equality. And I think we need to pay far greater attention to the relevance and importance of the private sector, including its regulation for gender equality and for human rights overall. We need to understand that women's machineries need to be strengthened much more than they have been, and particularly emphasize the catalytic role of the civil society organizations, of feminist and women's organizations that function as society's conscience keepers for gender equality and women's human rights. I thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Gita. It's always a great joy to hear you. You give us so much food for thought in a short time. You have positioned gender issues in the overarching socio-economic inequalities, bringing many issues, including health and paid care work, violence against women, and all these persistent gender inequalities, and highlighting the importance of addressing large context of macroeconomic policies, intersectionalities, gender norms, and the need to empower women's machineries and women's organizations. So indeed, this will set the tone for our discussion, not only for today, but also for tomorrow and for the entire session of the EGM. Thank you very much, Gita. Now, let me move to our final speaker for this panel, Ms. Lalini Singh. She's the Executive Director with the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. Lalini is a feminist and a social development specialist with over 20 years experience in design, implementation, management, monitoring, and evaluation of women's rights and development programs in Asia Pacific. Her particular interest is on the issues of women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, decent work, and organizational capacity strengthening. Lalini will share the CSO perspectives on the key priorities in the context of Beijing +25 review. The floor is yours, Lalini.
Thank you, Chai Chai. And colleagues, it's an honor to be part of this expert group meeting, and for this particular session to provide the CSO perspectives. Indeed, a very hard act to follow with such amazing speakers. But I take my cue from Gita, where she said that feminist organizations and women's rights organizations are society's conscience keepers for gender equality. So as such, I will attempt to provide some responses to the 4 questions that were posed earlier on. Foremostly, let me say thank you to SGAP and UN Women for keeping this conversation ongoing in a very challenging year in all fronts. However, women's organizations, as usual, are at the forefront, working shoulder to shoulder with all stakeholders to ensure that the recovery and the building up efforts in every country affected by COVID-19 is done with women at the center. Just as thousands of women who had gathered in Beijing 25 years ago, women are again the galvanizing forces now. This is not easy given the myriad of complexities each country has. Moving to the questions that I had, the next steps in realizing the goals set in the Beijing +25 declaration must be based on a firm recognition on the realities that did not lead us to achieving the Beijing goals in the first 25 years. What have been the key barriers to achieving those, and systematically addressing those at all levels? Commitments alone, even though a very noteworthy achievement in our region, will not bring about the change we want. We need an enormous boost in the political will of all states and stakeholders who right now seem to be paying lip service to the issues of women's rights and gender equality. Policy and legislative changes are a start, but these need to be backed up with resources to ensure that the accompanying accountable action and work plans are implemented, monitored, and adjusted to suit contexts. Women must be a part of all decision-making and must have a stake in what needs to be done. For them, with them, an inclusive approach must be taken so that no woman is left behind. We need to remember that the Asia-Pacific intergovernmental processes that led to this declaration did not recognize civil society as equal partners in the process of its development, change, and contributions to the outcome document. We were, in fact, locked out of the discussions, and the outcome document in the end did not fully commit itself to advancing the diverse women's and girls' human rights or recognition of the urgency of the climate crisis and emergency, especially for the Pacific. So what's needed right now is the commitment from governments to listen to women's voices. In fact, over 400 feminist organizations from all over the world have put together a feminist declaration on Beijing at 25, and we urge you to turn our demands into action now. Achieving the SDGs by 2030. Well, in my opinion, that is a pipe dream for us now. The SDGs were never about a rights-based approach to development, but as commitments go, and if we still have to divert our precious resources into achieving the SDG targets in the next decade, then my suggestion would be for all accelerated actions to be women and people-centered, formulated with women's civil society organizations' meaningful involvement. They must use intersectional analysis to map out the differentiated impacts on vulnerable groups that are already affected by the intersecting powers of globalization, fundamentalisms, militarism, and patriarchy. It is clearly evidence that the structural barriers to women's human rights and gender equality need to be removed as the first steps. Each and every action should also address specific structural issues that are deeply affecting people's lives in the region, including the climate crisis, the crisis in our democracies, neoliberal economic and trade policies, pushing countries into debt, amongst others. The solution is pretty clear based on the Beijing commitments, including strengthening public services, universal social protection, shifting economic and fiscal policies to reduce inequalities of resources and power and wealth within and between countries and between men and women. The COVID pandemic and gender equality. Well, instead of seeing the COVID pandemic as a threat to the progress that we have made, we perhaps should consider it as a portal that has revealed and exacerbated pre-existing structural and intersectional inequalities. In this context, we urge everyone to take actions that truly address the structural barriers to the advancement of women's human rights and define gender equality, as well as women's empowerment in the framework of feminist development justice. When we speak about partnerships and collaboration, women's human rights and gender equality is a question about power. And therefore, partnership and other initiatives must aim at shifting power relations for women and girls in all their diversities to hold power inherent to them as right holders, to make decisions over their own bodies, communities, and the planet. For any partnership to work, it requires courage and critical reflection to recognize our own power within, to exercise and impart that power to others. There's also a need for the recognition of historical and systemic oppression, exclusion, and marginalization of others, and action to redistribute power, wealth, and opportunities. A real partnership lies with women in their communities with power to affect changes from local to the global levels. A couple of examples I'd like to mention here. One is of the Asia Pacific Regional Civil Society Engagement Mechanism, or APRSEM. And this group has shown the power of organized cross-constituencies and movements with a shared vision and commitment to the development justice and led by feminist movements. APRSEM generates the recognition of structural barriers to sustainable development and has institutionalized the participation of civil society, particularly grassroots, in the SDG processes. Second is what we see now, and Emily mentioned this in her presentation earlier on. In most countries of the region, in response to COVID-19, there have been many gender working groups formed to address the intensely increased gender-based violence situation, or to provide the much needed gender perspectives and analysis on how diverse women will be impacted by COVID-19. These working groups, as the one in Fiji, comprises of representatives from the National Women's Machinery, women's rights organizations, gender experts, and UN agencies. And we in Fiji, who are part of the COVID response gender working group, worked for weeks pro bono to put together our analysis, which was done as early as in April 2020. Governments must exercise regulatory power over corporations as outlined in the Beijing commitments to reject public and private partnerships, which has been promoted under the guise of multi-stakeholder partnerships, and to expand public-public partnerships to realize government's human rights obligations as duty bearers and people's sovereignty as rights holders. To end, for partnerships and collaboration, the situation, the crisis of multilateralism must be addressed. We must address the increased and complicated issues of meaningful participation of civil society that we see now due to digital divide, lack of information access, etc. As you know, it was experienced at HLPF this year, as well as looking at funding crisis to sustain the work, the very important work done by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And maybe this is a space where we also talk about the importance of strengthening the resources that are available, for the women's movements, and not to reduce it or to divert it at this particular time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lalini. Really appreciate your sharing of CSO perspectives and suggestions and frank feedback. And we appreciate the fact that the intergovernmental meetings has its own challenges, constraints, and restrictions, both at the global level and the regional level. And we are reflecting also along the way how to ensure when we are organizing meetings, how to our best capacity to ensure CSO perspectives are reflected. Hence, perhaps you can see that as a result of that efforts together with our UN Women colleagues, for this EGM, we have ensured a large number of CSO participants. And also your suggestion on how we better utilize or continue to fully utilize the Asia-Pacific civil society engagement mechanism in both our gender meetings as well as broader forums on sustainable development is truly valuable. And finally, indeed, the partnership of CSO and government is symbiotic. It's not just for civil society. It is to the benefit of government. We will continue as UN do our part to foster that collaboration and partnership in everything we do, and also ask for your support along the way. And indeed, there is a long way to go. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives and valuable suggestions. So ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from our great panel with wonderful speakers for sharing their perspectives and insights. We have a few minutes. I'd like to open the floor for questions. I want to check with my colleague. Shanae, is there any specific questions for our panelists?
So far, we haven't received any in the chat box.
Okay. So since we haven't seen any specific questions and comments that require interventions at this point, and indeed I'm reaching the end of session 1, I will perhaps now conclude this session and hand over to our MC for proceeding to the next panel. And if we perhaps, I think our participants are reflecting on the specific issues, and then we will have ample opportunities for raising questions and providing inputs and comments in the next 3 sessions. Over to you, MC.
Thank you very much, Chai Chai, and for concluding the first session of our meeting. We will now move into session number 2 on women's economic empowerment. This session will offer perspectives on challenges and opportunities to enhance women's economic empowerment, including in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The session is going to be moderated by Ms. Joni Simpson. She is the Senior Specialist on Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination for East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific for the International Labour Organization. She has more than 20 years of experience promoting women's leadership and women's entrepreneurship. In her current role, Ms. Simpson provides technical guidance and support on gender equality, non-discrimination, and women's economic empowerment approaches to ILO constituents and partners for policies and programs relating to gender inclusion and non-discrimination in the world of work. She is also joined by Ms. Chai Chai, who will firstly provide a brief overview presentation to this meeting. May I please ask Ms. Chai Chai first to take the floor and welcome Ms. Joni Simpson to the meeting.
Thank you, Shanae. Okay, let me turn on the video. Okay, so, okay. I will do a very, very brief introduction because we have excellent speakers for this panel, and they each bring their unique perspective and experience in addressing different dimensions of women's economic empowerment. So I will just go over a few broad issues concerning women's economic empowerment. As you can see from these slides, there are some key factors we need to consider when we talk about women's economic empowerment. Their access to property, assets, financial services, their access to social protection, opportunities for education, skills enhancement, training, and overall, all this underline their opportunities for earning decent income, decent jobs, right? And we also need to consider the overarching issues in terms of time poverty, which concerns women across the sectors at every level, and how this restricts their economic participation, their advancement in terms of career. And perhaps very importantly, we needed to consider women's representation and collective action, because piecemeal change wouldn't last. We need that collective power from women to generate a movement to shake the system. Very briefly, I want to just show you the next slide in terms of the current situation, in terms of, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so women's labor force participation very clearly is way behind men. Okay, so over 30% of gender gap. This is totally unacceptable. And this is only a tiny reflection of gender gaps in terms of economic empowerment. And there are many factors behind these gaps, whether it's the unpaid care work, whether it's the overarching structural issues in the economic system, and whether it's our policy framework. All this needs to come into play to reduce the gender gaps. Okay, move to the next slide, please. And also equally concerning is while women are working, for those who are working, you will find the majority of them are in the informal sector. 36%, only 36%, 1/3 of women who are working are in the formal sector with some sort of perhaps decent income, not all of them, but some. And almost, you know, for those, the entire women population working in informal sector, they don't have access to social protection. And when there's a situation of COVID or other crises, they were not only stripped of income, they were stripped of all other protection. So this is a very important issue for us to consider how to empower women economically. Move to the next slide, please. Another critical important issue we needed to address through this session is the unpaid care work, because women simply don't have time to participate, whether it's in economic activities, leisure, or political participation. And you can see in Asia Pacific, women work the longest hour compared with the world average. When you add up both the time for paid work and unpaid work, and they work 3 times more than men when it comes to unpaid care work. Next slide, please. So I have showed you just a few slides highlighting some symptoms. How do we address these issues? And how do we address the underlying factors behind these symptoms? These are going to be the focus of this session. But I want to briefly highlight some of the key recommendations already laid out in the Beijing Plus 25 outcome document. In terms of enhancing women's labor force participation, while we pay attention to the workplace issue, the overall enabling environment, gender parity in the workplace, we must also look at additional opportunities, including enhancing women's entrepreneurship and what role private sector can play in that context. We also have to look at the overarching macroeconomic policies, as Gita has mentioned earlier, and how do we create that enabling environment for women to utilize their talent and potential to be the women entrepreneurs and to be leaders in all the sectors. Now, how do we address the informal work? ILO has done a lot in this, but this is an area with tremendous challenges. Many governments are struggling with ways to do this. Your perspective, your suggestions will be truly valuable to us. But so the key strategy in facilitating transition from formal from informal to formal is vital here. And related that women will be able to benefit from legal and social protection if they are able to move into the formal sector. And finally, we must address unpaid care work, both through promoting the equal share of unpaid care work at home, and also through government action, policies and programs to invest in the care economy, invest in quality care services and care-related infrastructures, And in that process, not only we liberate women from unpaid care work and generate a lot of decent job opportunities. I will stop here and hand over back to the moderator of this session. Juni, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chai. Distinguished participants, it's a pleasure to take part in this event, and we have a very exciting panel of presentations and discussants. So I will go right into it, and I would like to first call upon Ms. Yam Kumari Katiwada, Secretary, Ministry of Women, Children and Senior Citizens from Nepal. She is currently the Secretary at the Ministry of Women, Children, Senior Citizens. She's been serving for more than 24 years in various capacities within the government. Prior to her current appointment, she was the Secretary at the Ministry of Industry, Commerce and Supplies, dealing with the policy issues of the industrial sector under various responsibilities. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Madam Secretary. Would you like to take the floor?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished delegates from member state of UNESCAP and UN Women, civil societies, ladies and gentlemen, I express my sincere appreciation to UNESCAP and UN Women for organizing this expert group meeting despite of this unfavorable situation and providing me this opportunity to share the status of Nepal and especially the initiatives towards gender equality and women's economic empowerment. So I have prepared some achievements, some slides covering overall achievements towards gender equality and women's empowerment, but I will focus to the economic empowerment of women as because of this time constraint, and I will also focus a little bit about this COVID impact and response. Actually, our constitution of Nepal is very progressive, democratic, inclusive towards gender equality and empowerment, which has provisioned many fundamental rights for women, and some of the participation it has guaranteed even in the constitution. So I'll just skip this slide. This is only the provision of constitution. So could you please go to the next slide? So I just want to move to the political representation. So if we see the political representation in federal parliament is 33%. So could you please move to the another slide, next slide? Yeah, thank you. State assembly, in state assembly there is 34% of women participation, and in local level assembly is 41%. This is really encouraging. And we have more than 90% deputy mayor or vice chair of local government. And out of 16 women chairperson in federal parliament, parliamentary committee, we have 9 of them are women. Similarly, if we see the next slide, please. This is the employment and professional scenario of Nepalese women. This is a figure in different sectors. Civil service, we have 26%, health professional, and doctors, engineers, journalists, small and large entrepreneurs, enterprises, it is 37%, and labor force participation and cooperatives. This is just, I want to highlight this, how the participation of women in governmental and non-governmental sector is increasing encouragingly. So if we see the sectoral achievements, next slide, please. I just want to go just two indicators. Gender parity index in secondary education is 1.037, and net enrollment rate of girls at primary level is 97%. Similarly, in health sector, maternal mortality rate at 239 and child mortality rate 39 per 100,000 live birth. So this is also decreasing. This is also very much encouraging. Now let me move to the COVID impact, which has been impacted mostly to our protection cluster and the people who are in safety net, especially women, children, senior citizens, and people with different ability. It has impacted on reproductive health care of women, domestic and gender-based violence, a loss of job inside the country and foreign employment, problem in mental health, psychosocial and suicide cases, problem in livelihood due to financial crisis, impact in child education, so on. These are some of the major impacts. So I would like to move to the response to COVID. So we have a steering committee with plan of action at federal, provincial, and local level in all level of government, and ministry is leading the protection cluster. So could you please move to the another slide? Ministry is leading the protection cluster with the coordination and collaboration of other stakeholders. National and international non-governmental organizations and civil societies have been mobilized in coordination with local government to respond to the impact of COVID-19 up to the community level. Gender response guidelines to response COVID has been formulated and it is in implementation. Community psychosocial counselors have been mobilized in all provinces and even in the local level and up to the community, distributing dignity kits, organizing awareness programs, and similarly on awareness program and information on safety measures of COVID-19 and against the gender-based violence during the COVID has been disseminated at the community level with the coordination of local level government. And rapid gender assessment has been done, JC checklist prepared, and we have also monitored the quarantines and service centers jointly with UN agency. So could you please move to another slide? So I will jump to the initiative for women's economic empowerment. So I would like to request to move to that slide. So the next slide, yes, thank you. We have a provision by law that women-owned industry will get 35% of rebate in industry registration and 20% in intellectual property registration, establishment of separate women's entrepreneurship development fund, income tax rebate for 10 years for women micro-entrepreneurs, dedicated center to facilitate women entrepreneurs in each local level is in the process of establishment. Livelihood program at local level is in implementation. Complete package of entrepreneurship program is in local level is being implemented with the provision of 70% women beneficiary. Technology support and seed money is being provided to start their business. Startup fund from different organizations is being implemented to support women's entrepreneurs. As most of the women entrepreneurs in Nepal are involving in SMEs, dedicated industrial villages are being established to cluster them, and a dedicated exhibition center for women's entrepreneurs product is in process of establishment. So next slide, please. Now I would like to move to the economic relief package to respond this COVID. Actually, government has declared recently very stimulative and attractive economic package. This is for all entrepreneurs and especially focusing the tourism industry and the MSMEs. So this is for women and men entrepreneurs. There is a long list actually. It's very good package. I'll just read some of them. A fund worth of 50 billion of for badly affected sectors, especially tourism and MSMEs, for loans with the minimum interest rate to revive and paying staff salary. Rescue package through monetary policy to mitigate the economic effects of COVID-19 for relief and revive of the various sectors has been declared, focusing on reduce, refinance, and restructuring. 3R, the loans. So there are long lists. So I would like to request the organizer to share this slide, but I would not read these all because this is very long, long list. So I'd like to skip this slide. So could you please move to the another slide? There are three, yes, challenges and problem. Yeah, there are three slides. They only focused the economic, the incentive, especially to reactivate the economic activities which have been badly affected to the by the COVID. So challenges and problems to cope with gender issue is institutionalization and mainstreaming the gender issue in all levels of government, and lack of adequate education and awareness, unemployment and poverty, and discrimination and violence and harm practice in the society are some of the problems and challenges to tackle with the gender issue. Inadequate coordination among the three levels of government for joint campaign in such issues. Tackling with the pandemics. As every sector is affected by this pandemic, it's very difficult to tackle. And also responding to psychosocial impact as women, children, senior citizens, and different level people are affected mostly by this pandemic. And to revive the economy and resource generation is also another problem. And lack of disaggregated data is also one problem to issue the policy. To overcome these all issues for gender equality and empowerment, could you please move to the another slide? I have just last slide. Yes. So way forward to overcome these issues for gender equality and women empowerment, the government, especially the ministry, is working with the 4 pillars of strategies. Institutionalization and mainstreaming of international commitment through its policies, plan, program, and budget in all levels of government, because Nepal is recently moving to federal structure from its unitary structure. So it's really challenging to mainstreaming these all issues to all level of government. And our another focus is to protect the people who are within the safety net so through rescue, relief, and rehabilitation. Another important pillar is empowerment. It is basically economic empowerment so through generation of employment, self-employment, livelihood program, and entrepreneurship, and quality health and education. And response to pandemics. That is, now we are facing the problem of COVID-19, and we are going to carry on these all strategies with cooperation and coordination with all level of government, especially with the local level government, and national and international non-governmental organizations and development partners, and so on. So I'll end this presentation, and if there is some queries and questions, I'll get you back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Katiwada. Very good opening presentation, discussing the many initiatives that you have ongoing, but also the need for integrated approach with all of the levels involved. Regarding the importance of women's leadership the advancements you've made on education and health of women and girls, and the various responses with a very strong focus there on micro and small enterprises across very many of the most hardest hit sectors that women are working in. Thank you for that. And I'd like to encourage people to start putting their questions in the chat box for our speakers. We'll be coming to them in a minute. And thank you so much. Now I'll move on to the next presentation, which is around the care economy and women's economic participation. We're asking speakers to stick to the 8 minutes, please, if you could. And for this session, actually, for this particular presentation, we have 2 speakers. So to start with, I'd like to introduce Ms. Deepta Chopra, Research Fellow of the Institute of Development Studies. She is a feminist social scientist leading IDS's work on women's empowerment and unpaid care. Her research interests primarily focus on the empowerment of women and girls and its core links with their paid work and unpaid care work. She has developed and implemented several research projects on the politics of policy processes and gendered political economy analysis of women's economic empowerment programs and policies. Deepta has worked extensively on the Mahatma Gandhi Food Rights Act in India. She works closely with state and non-state partners in South Asia and has had high impacts in policy and practice in international development, and in particular, relation to our work on the care economy and MGNREGA. With her is Ms. Meenakshi Krishnan. Sorry if I'm chopping your names. Organization development consultant and doctoral researcher for the Institute of Development Studies. Ms. Krishnan works in the areas of gendered political economy, women's empowerment, and social protection. Her particular research interests are exploring the links between paid care and unpaid care work, gendered division of unpaid care, and impact of family-friendly policies on gender relations. She's co-authored evidence-based briefs and working papers on family-friendly policies and women's interactions between childcare and economic engagement. Her PhD is a gendered political economy analysis of maternity benefit amendment acts in India from a feminist political ethics of care lens. I think I'll stop there for the introductions. I think we're in very good hands on this topic of care, and I'd like to hand over for the presentation, please.
Hi, I think the audio will also accompany the recording.
We're taking care of the issue here. Just one moment. Thank you for your patience. So as we work towards getting the technical issue taken care of here, we're going to move to the next speaker, and that way we won't lose too much time. Just one moment, please, as she sets up. Thank you for your patience. Okay, we're set up for moving on to our next speaker. And what we'll end up doing here is just change things around a little bit. We're going to move on to the Fostering Enabling Environment for Women Entrepreneurs in Asia Pacific presentation. Then we'll move on to private sector engagement, and then we'll come back to the care economy. And that should be a nice smooth transition at any sense, and give sufficient time to fix the technical issue. So I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Sudha Guti, who is the program manager for Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship Program at UNESCAP. Prior to joining ESCAP, Ms. Guti has been working for the past 15 years with various UN agencies such as UNDP and IOM in different countries of Asia. Her areas of focus have been gender and governance, disaster risk reduction, and poverty reduction. ESCAP actively supports its member states in their efforts to enhance women's economic empowerment and entrepreneurship as a strategy for poverty reduction, social well-being, and sustainable economic growth. I'd like to hand over now to Ms. Sudha Guti for her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joni, and good morning, and good morning to all colleagues, and good afternoon to all our colleagues on the Fiji there. So it's been a fascinating morning of presentations where a number of issues have been covered in terms of the barriers as well as the opportunities that women in our region are facing, and what are some of the solutions that we can come up with, especially in this unprecedented context. My presentation will focus more on the entrepreneurship and look at the overall situation of entrepreneurship, but also then move a little bit more into the COVID context. So I won't repeat many of the statistics that are coming in. We've also had an excellent presentation from our UN Women colleague a few minutes back. But it's important to note that entrepreneurship, as raised by several speakers, is one of the main pathways of women's economic empowerment. And this does have a multiplier effect on family, on well-being, and overall sustainable growth. We also see that in our region, the micro, small, and medium enterprises account for more than 96% of all enterprises, providing employment for more than 62%. And out of this, we see that women own up to 50 to 59%, just in Southeast Asia and Pacific as an example. This is very telling in terms of not only the significance of women entrepreneurs, but also the potential for growth when it comes to the whole entrepreneurship and women in the region. Very quickly, I will move to what we're doing in terms of women entrepreneurship on behalf of ESCAP. At ESCAP, one of the core areas of our work is on supporting our member states to strengthen women's economic empowerment, and we consider entrepreneurship as a very important strategy for this. This program is focusing on 3 different pillars, looking at the policy and the enabling environment in which women entrepreneurs function. We look at the various impact of policies and laws and regulations, sociocultural norms in which women entrepreneurs function in a country, and try to support a better enabling environment there. We also work on addressing the credit gap that women entrepreneurs face through our innovative financing pillar, where we look at 3 different modalities of engaging in this, looking at a challenge fund, where we promote more fintech related programs. We also work on a livelihood bond, as well as an impact investment fund in partnership with various other agencies. And we also look at strengthening the information communication technology and business skills of women entrepreneurs, which especially now is a very important pillar of our work. Before I move into the COVID context, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we're doing in this program, and looking more from the perspective of the role of the governance. We work with a number of partners and stakeholders at the country level, but I just wanted to highlight some of the initiatives and the innovations that our country governments are leading through this program. The policy pillar of the Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship Program looks at 5 different ways of engaging at the national level. We look at evidence and generating evidence through in-depth research, For example, we have done a number of studies in Samoa. We will be doing a study in Fiji as well as in Bangladesh, looking at the barriers that women entrepreneurs face in these countries, not only on the overall enabling environment, but also looking at specific issues related to access and usage of finance, looking at access and usage of ICT in these countries. Through the evidence generated, we also provide a lot of technical assistance that helps us to work with the existing laws, regulations that the women entrepreneurs work in these countries. For example, in Vietnam, we're working on looking at the impact of the SME law in the country and how the women-led enterprises benefit or not from the SME law, and what provisions need to be included in better implementation of the SME law. Similarly, in Cambodia, and I know that some of our colleagues from Cambodia are also on the meeting today, we worked on the national SME policy to include special provisions that benefit women entrepreneurs in Cambodia. We also look at capacity development as a very important pillar in this program. We work with a number of governments on looking at skill development of women entrepreneurs on ICT and other aspects, but also government is leading some of these initiatives. For example, again, in Cambodia, the Ministry of Women Affairs, we're working very closely on the design of an entrepreneurship development institute there, which not only is looking at innovations from the region and beyond, but is also building on local innovations in Cambodia, such as the work that She Investments and others are doing in there. We also believe that setting up multi-stakeholder mechanisms is an extremely important component of creating this ecosystem for women entrepreneurs to thrive. We also, of course, like the meeting today itself, we also bring this issue to the table at various regional and global platforms to look at exchange of innovative solutions when it comes to women entrepreneurs. I'll dive straight into the COVID context now, the focus really of our discussions largely today. And of course, we are seeing that COVID has impacted women entrepreneurs heavily. We have seen the statistics already that our colleague Sarah has explained very well. I won't repeat it, but we see that this has had a tremendous impact on the enterprises as well as the women employed in all of these enterprises. It goes to say that men are also impacted, but it's the additional vulnerability that women are exposed to which makes it worse. At SCAP, through the Catalyzing Women's Entrepreneurship Program, we've done a few preliminary studies to dive deep into some of these issues and collectively come up with some solutions for our government partners. And I'll take a few minutes to focus on some of the studies. Those are the 3 countries that we've done studies, and we're also doing it in a few others. But I'll dive into a couple of slides to give a flavor of some of the recommendations that are coming out of these specific studies. And hopefully these will be useful even for countries beyond where we've done these studies. So a quick glimpse of the Cambodia study that we did. The Cambodia policy guideline was developed on a very quick assessment of the COVID-19 pandemic on women entrepreneurs there. And really, there were no surprises in terms of how this has impacted, especially the informal sector, where the access to financial services is very limited. There was already existing low levels of collateral and asset ownership of several women entrepreneurs, and the COVID-19 only made it harder for them to access any kind of finance. There were significant socio-cultural barriers that further added to women entrepreneurs' access to services after COVID. Internet, digital literacy in rural areas further restricted women's ability to conduct business online. Added to this was that electricity connection was unreliable in rural areas, making e-commerce and other ICT-based solutions not viable. And also, when we look at the informal and micro enterprises, they do not have normally large cash reserves to also cope with such pandemics. So these were some of the recommendations we came up with. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in Cambodia is, of course, data-informed policymaking. And we've also seen this from the experience of the Ebola pandemic, that the need to collect quality data to understand and measure the extent of the effect is extremely important. And policymakers can use this significantly in designing some of the mechanisms. I will not go into all of the recommendations, but we'll be happy to share the full paper subsequently. But I just wanted to take less than a minute also to focus on some of the recommendations coming out of Vietnam. Vietnam was a much more in-depth study we conducted of doing an online survey of 220 enterprises, with more than 61% of it women-led. And some of the findings were very interesting. Notably, it was also showing that women-led enterprises had a better resilience in coping with some of the issues that came out. These are also highlighted in some of the slides, which can be shared with all of you. In the interest of time, I'll just go straight into the recommendations. One of the things that was very interesting, and let me just highlight this slide for a moment, is we also did a little bit of an assessment of what enterprises perceived in terms of the support policies that were available by the government. And it showed that almost 63% of the enterprises were aware of the policies. But when it came to actual usage of the support that was available and the information, it came down to about 2% in many of the regions. So this also shows that the issue is not only about provision of services for women entrepreneurs in general, but also how it becomes accessible, how the information is disseminated, which is extremely important. So here are some of the overall measures that we've clustered. An important aspect that came out of the study is it's critical to not let the overall progress that women entrepreneurs have made be derailed because of COVID-19. So while measures are being put in place in the short term, it's extremely important that the long-term measures that were happening before COVID are not forgotten, and those continue in parallel in terms of building a better ecosystem for women entrepreneurs. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that there are. And leave this last slide on as silver linings also that have come out of COVID-19 and how some of the enterprises have shown resilience in the wake of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Guti. A very interesting presentation with a lot of rich information and data, really highlighting the importance of women's entrepreneurship development and women's leadership in the private sector. As we can see, there are multiple barriers, even in COVID times, which some of them reflect women's barriers when we look at employment as well, quality of jobs and opportunities that they can avail as women entrepreneurs. So ESCAP is covering a lot of areas with a very strong focus on access to finance, but I really do appreciate the strong evidence-based policy making that you're pushing at the national level. Often we get regional reports that don't go into such depth, and I think it shows that you're able to make strong linkages at the local level with various partners and stakeholders already involved in this area and strengthening that ecosystem. So thank you so much for that, and we invite participants to have a look at all of the details that are found not only in the presentation, but as well as, I believe, reports that are available. So that is our presentation looking at enabling environment for women entrepreneurs in Asia Pacific. And now we're going to move on to the next speaker, working on holistic approaches to private sector engagement to boost women's economic empowerment. And we have esteemed speaker, Katja Friwald, a regional program lead for We Empower Asia at UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Friedwald Ms. Freewald leads UN Women's commitment under Women's Economic Empowerment and Migration focus in Asia and the Pacific. She oversees We Empower Asia at UN Women's program, which is funded and in partnership with the European Union, and is aiming to increase the number of women who lead and participate in business. The countries of focus are China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, so quite a broad reach. And a key component of the program is to mobilize the private sector companies to become more gender responsive. Now we have another 8 minutes for Katja. I hand over to you and take the floor, please, Katja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joni, and I will try to be as efficient as possible to keep us on track in time. And you have set the scene brilliantly and gave already a little bit of an introduction into the program. And I'm also going to keep it very much speaking about the program for the simple reason I really want to kind of find a way to bridge the gap between talking and walking. And We Empower Asia, as Joni laid out quite clearly, is a program which is aiming to promote women's economic empowerment, and particularly really focusing on increasing women's economic participation in Asia and the Pacific, and specifically the 7 countries we have heard before. As clearly stated also in the Asia Pacific Beijing Declaration, the role of the private sector is very important in achieving women's economic empowerment. And particularly, I think, in the current situation that we are in, where we are really focusing on a more gender equal and inclusive recovery from the pandemic, we have been speaking with quite a lot of private sector actors in the region and beyond. And while I have to say there's a lot of good practices to be shared, and happy to do this in more detail, but there's a lot of work to be done as well. Also recognizing very strongly that the importance that our region has really signed and ratified a lot of international conventions or implemented guiding principles like the business and human rights principles to really engage private sector much more clearly in this agenda. Now, the way how at We Empower Asia, we are trying to really create a more sort of blueprint of collaboration and really amplifying the role of the private sector is kind of focused on 3 pillars. So looking at the circle on the slide, the 3 pillars that we are looking at is first, obviously working with private sector companies, national companies, international companies, and really driving more business inclusive cultures. The second pillar is all about gender inclusive entrepreneurship, and Sudha has shared a lot of that already. But when we speak about gender inclusive entrepreneurship, I really want to highlight that it's not only about supporting women entrepreneurs, which is a very strong focus of this, but really we've heard our ecosystem of entrepreneurs, 96% in Asia Pacific are small, medium enterprises. So we really want to work on bringing this ecosystem, a gender lens to this ecosystem. So not only working with women entrepreneurs, but with the real ecosystem around entrepreneurship. And last but not least, I think bringing both things together, when we're speaking about the enabling environment, these are really initiatives within our program where we look at policy context, but also bringing, for example, entrepreneurs and the private sector, bigger companies together, providing market access in a more gender inclusive way. Now let me move on and just show this example or this framework which we kind of try to test in different areas. And I know we're going to be hearing a little bit more about care and the care economy in a while, but I just want to share the same framework of these 3 pillars. We have started at UN Women to really kind of engage with our partners, CSOs, governments, and the private sector to really apply this framework to the care economy. So basically what you're looking at here is our attempt and our call for action to really create an action alliance for care work. And ladies and gentlemen, let me just say, if there is not a better moment than now to really address this. I don't know when there will be a better moment. I think I'm not repeating all the evidences. We have heard enough statistics today, not only about the issue and unpaid care work as an issue to hold women back to participate in the economy, but let me emphasize on the opportunity of the care economy that really has the opportunity to provide way more jobs in our region, and ILO has done a lot of studies around that. And we will seeing also that our region will need more care professions with a very a trend of elderly population. But the way how to really address this needs to be collaborative in an inclusive way. So really looking at government actions like care financing, like providing infrastructure. But then I'm also pleased we're going to be hearing from an entrepreneur that we have been working very strongly with in Malaysia to provide really opportunities in the care economy, which is about turning the women's entrepreneurship opportunity into the care economy. So we will be seeing models on how women entrepreneurs can really thrive or solve the care challenge, but also looking care as a provision for more jobs in our regions. And as Joni said in the beginning, I'm looking also at our migration work, and obviously there's a lot of migrants in our regions that are employed in the domestic sector most of the time in a very informal way. So there's a big opportunity to also use that economy for the benefits of our Asian Pacific economy. And last but not least, the role of private sector that we are emphasizing on is really strong in the care economy as well. And just kind of one of the examples I want to share, we are working in Vietnam, obviously very strongly in our program. There's a lot of evidence now coming out, some of the private sectors investing in care facilities, for example, increasing their efficiency by 20% by reducing absenteeism. So there's a big business case for the care economy, which needs to be really an inclusive approach that we are seeking for. Now, speaking about the private sector, I just want to highlight, obviously unpaid care work is one area, but we have heard about a lot of other areas today as well. And it's not only the year of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, but at UN Women and with our partners, we are also celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Women's Empowerment Principles, which is an initiative between Global Compact and UN Women to really help to drive more private sector action, to really build more gender inclusive businesses. And as you can see here, and I'm not going in all detail, but it's really a blueprint on different actions, looking at corporate leadership, looking at gender equality in the workplace, including addressing things like sexual harassment, is looking about upskilling for women in companies, really addressing things like the digital gap, for example. But also looking into things like how to procuring much more from women-owned enterprises. So gender responsive procurement is a big area within this. So while this is for the moment a volunteer framework in at a global level, we in Asia Pacific really want to kind of drive this much more forward as something which companies can be held accountable for. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to say, and leave you probably with this thought that we have a call for action for companies to share best practices, and we have seen a lot of this, and I think this is one way to stimulate more action, but I don't think that's the only way, and it's the way that will systemically change the way how private sector incorporates a gender lens in their operations. So what we are calling for is really formalizing much more reporting, transparency on how private sector is embracing gender equality in their operations. So you will be seeing more, and we've been working with our colleagues from ASEAN on some more study and research around gender reporting of the private sector in our regions. And let me close this by this. I think we need to create this transparency now much more than ever, because through this transparency, we only gonna create transformation that is really needed to not reverse the strikes that we have made on women's economic empowerment in our region. With this, thank you very much. And I'll hand it over to Joni, and hope we kept us in time.
Right on time. Thank you very much, Katja. a very interesting, exciting program looking at both sides of what seems to be the same coin of women-led enterprises, improving their opportunities, but at the same time looking at enterprises themselves and creating more gender responsive workplaces. I like that you've talked a lot about the opportunity to grow accessible, affordable, professional care services, looking at the care economy solutions that are emerging and need those critical investments from governments, but also other stakeholders, and taking into account the undervaluing of both paid and unpaid care. And we see through your rich examples of showcasing the opportunities related to the WEPS framework to further enhance private sector's involvement in making workplaces more gender responsive. But I like that you ended off with accountability and transparency, which seems to be critical these days, especially in COVID-19, and as we heard in the beginning, we're seeing regression in some areas. So this will be very important to keep pushing on upholding the already agreed commitments. Thank you so much for this presentation. And now we will have our final presentation, which is on the care economy, and we've had our technicians come to set it up. I had already introduced Ms. Deepta Chopra and Ms. Minakashi Krishnan. So I think we can move on to this presentation, Care Economy and Women's Economic Participation. Are we ready?
Studies, and I'm going to give you a little brief background of the care economy and women's economic participation, specifically focusing on the challenges and opportunities that COVID has given us. So as we know that care is not just direct care as in care of people, but it's also indirect care, which is like looking after the household, cooking, cleaning, and also collecting firewood and water, which forms a big part of women's lives. We do know that that care is necessary for the social reproduction and sustenance of life and human beings, and this is not an audience that I would want to go into much more detail, because you guys already know this. That but what is really important to understand and to keep in mind while we go through thinking about care is that care has a widespread, long-term and positive impact on well-being and development, and it is critical to address inequality and vulnerability. Now, there are bidirectional loops between care economy and the paid economy, and by bidirectional I mean that, and in as much as care affects women's paid work also affects the quality and quantity of care that they do. But when we think about unpaid care work, we also think that women, that it does occupy, literature tells us that it occupies large amounts of women and girls' time, which then in turn restricts their participation in civil, economic and social spheres. Unpaid care work interacts with paid work in many ways. Because of unpaid care work, women are choose, and I put that in inverted commas, to take informal sector jobs, because these choices are not necessarily choices that they would make without the constraints that care puts on them. But also then the drudgery that is involved in taking care of people, or cooking or cleaning, or especially collecting firewood and water, really affects women's health and productivity. On the other hand, that these informal sector jobs that women do, they're also very drudgerous, and this then affects, as I said, the quantity and quality of care and the women's health and productivity in the care economy as well. It leads to lower bargaining power, and the most significant effects that we've seen in our research is about time poverty, tiredness and depletion due to multitasking and interrupted sleep. We've also seen that because of when women go out to do paid work, there is an increase in care responsibilities for young girls and older women. Really the premise, the basic premise of this talk is to say that when we talk about women's empowerment, it really requires a balance between paid work and unpaid care work to avoid depletion. And that when we talk about economic empowerment, we really cannot just talk about labor force participation, but we also need to take into account the care work that women and girls do. Just some figures here. Time spent daily in unpaid care work, paid work and total work by sex, by region and by income group, and you will see that in every single region of the world, women do more unpaid care work than men, less paid work than women. Now what is stark about the Asia Pacific region is that cumulatively women are doing the largest amount of care and paid work and total work in the whole of the world, and that gives us, needs to give us pause for thought. Now this is another graph again from the same ILO report, which talks about how what stops women from engaging in paid work, and again the work-family balance as well as affordable care is one of some of the highest categories of how women perceive themselves as being challenged in order to take on paid jobs. Now COVID-19 has exacerbated these inequalities and increased the precarity of these vulnerable populations, especially women, in three ways. They've reduced women's economic participation because women, as with everybody, economic sphere has really declined, but the most significant effect obviously has been to women's work, especially in the informal economy. It has increased women's care workload, and it has also created new challenges for responsibilities such as food provision and water provision, and how do you go and collect water in situations of lockdown, or buy food, and women have had to spend large amounts of time queuing for food. And the third, of course, thing that COVID has done is reduction of state provision of public services because of the pressure on resources. The Beijing Plus 25 agenda, the 2030 agenda, really requires a focus on tackling high rates of women's informal work, provision of social protection, as well as incentives for them to remain in the workforce. So when we talk about COVID and an effective recovery plan, it really needs to be differentiated to account for different needs and responsibilities that women have as compared to men have, but also thinking about specific vulnerable groups like women in the informal sector, like the Beijing 25 agenda has focused our attention on. Now, our research is really thinking about what are the care differentiate policies that have been initiated in the Asia Pacific region as a response to COVID-19, and to provide policy recommendations and guidelines on these specific policy initiatives that can be taken. But we are also really wanting to dig deep into two separate in-depth case studies into countries of the Asia Pacific region, with providing specific country-specific recommendations. Keeping in mind, of course, women's differential and specific needs in these two countries due to their unpaid care work. Our conceptual framework then thinks about the fact of what I've said, which is that recognition of care is foundational. But when we talk about the care economy and unpaid care work, we know already that individual and household characteristics, country-specific context, as well as emerging socioeconomic trends in the region or in that country are going to affect how the care economy works. But with COVID, we need to now think about differentiated policy responses, and we've classified them into four types. One is care infrastructure, the second is care-related social protection transfers, the third is care services, and the fourth is employment-related policies. So I conclude really my presentation with some of the priority issues that we think we need to address in the Asia Pacific region, and after this I'll open the floor to question and answers, which my colleague Meenakshi will answer. And so these priority issues really are fourfold. One is obviously to move from what we call a double burden of women in terms of looking at both paid work as well as their unpaid care work to a double boon situation, which incorporates provision of decent paid work that empowers women and provides support for their unpaid care work. And this really includes the provision of social protection initiatives. When we talk about decent work, we need to talk about not only flexible working times, but also safe and affordable transportation that gets women to and from their paid work with minimum time, energy, and resources. Reduction of the drudgery of paid work through technological innovations, and adequate remuneration, specifically gender equal pay. And we can think of policies that provide support for unpaid care work, and this can be through recognition of care work through collection of sex disaggregated data. Time use surveys are very important in this. Provision of childcare services, but also maternity protection services. Provision of healthcare and education so that women are able to take care of their children and their families in a more sustainable way. Again, reduction of drudgery of care work through technological innovations, cooking stoves, but also piped water are important. Gas, provision of gas is really important. And redistribution of care work to the state, provision of public services, as well as change in social norms so that men can take on care work responsibilities as and when possible. And finally, representation of carers in decision making, where we're going to talk about policies that really include women in their in decision making processes. So with that, I leave you. Thank you so much for your attention today, and I look forward to your feedback. Thanks very much.
So we thank the speaker for their very comprehensive presentation on care. Looking to see the role of each player in upholding that service as a public good as well. And I'd like to mention from the ILO side, of course, we're always pushing to say that the government has a very strong role to play in terms of public care services, but also acknowledging, as you've well put, the country-specific contexts will play out in how care infrastructures work. You mentioned integrated approaches towards addressing paid and unpaid care, and I was very happy to hear you mention equal pay for work of equal value, and just mentioning that September 18th is International Equal Pay Day. If you didn't know, there'll be a celebration for the first time on this, but significant gender pay gap, and in particular in terms of undervaluing of the care economy. I also wanted to thank you for bringing up the issue of violence and harassment as well. As you've mentioned, care sector has a large proportion, of course, majority women, but also a large proportion of domestic workers, and is providing opportunities to address this very important and critical service that will enable more women to participate actively in the economy, but at the same time, a sector fraught with challenges. So there's a lot to be done to address this, but many opportunities laid out in the recommendations. And I thank you very much for that. All right, we've been through 4 presentations, and now is the time to reach over to our discussants, who are 2, and both have very important perspectives to share with us on the various topics that we've addressed during the session so far. I will start with Ms. Nadira Maud Yusuf, who is the founder and CEO of KiddoCare. And she is also part of the ASEAN Women Entrepreneurs Network, the head in Malaysia. Ms. Yusuf is the founder of KiddoCare, which is the first of its kind in Malaysia, a mobile platform that connects parents with trained, reliable babysitters and childminders. Inspired by ride-hailing service like Grab, Kiddo Care enables women to grab a babysitter from the comforts of their home. Kiddo Care also provides a platform for women to pursue their career in childcare or children's education, economically empowering them with more flexible employment arrangements and growth opportunities. I'll hand over to Ms. Yusuf, and the floor is yours for 5 minutes of discussant comments. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here together with everyone in the expert group meeting. I guess listening to all the presenters, the issues of how COVID actually affects us is very real. And in Malaysia, I think we're quite blessed that the government has been putting a lot of incentives to help entrepreneurs as well as women to rise through this economic recovery period. And I'd like to also very happy to share with everyone that Kiddo Care is currently also one of the vehicles that has been recognized as an economic recovery vehicle for women economic empowerment. Okay, so how we're dealing with things here, just like everything that has been shared, we are trying to promote a lot more women going into entrepreneurship. And I guess in Malaysia, we can clearly see that our women tend to thrive better than our male counterpart, I suppose, because of the nature of business itself. So many women are in the production of food businesses and services that are needed for during the COVID period. So many women actually do a lot better in terms of their business, but this depends on the ability of getting access to technology, the ability of having good supply chain access that can import transport their products and things like that. And because women's businesses tend to be a lot smaller than men's businesses in micro and smaller businesses, they could sustain themselves better, unless of course they are very limited to that locality, and then they will have to find the difficulty. I guess the pie has always been small for women entrepreneurs in general, but the COVID has further shrunk that pie. And what we have to do is to increase that pie for women if we want them to be better empowered. So in terms of what Kiddo Care is doing, we are providing vehicle for women who has been displaced of their jobs, especially those in the service sectors that has been much affected. Aviation industry, hotel industry, although it's picking up pretty well in Malaysia, but aviation has been seriously affected, to repurpose their skills and come in to see how they could participate in care work. And that has been pretty successful. Our types of service that allows personal care at home also addresses real need for care services, especially by the frontliners during the lockdown. And now we're looking at making personalized childcare even more affordable by establishing social enterprise transit centers, partnering with corporate organizations and government, looking into unused facilities, government facilities, mosque and things like that, converting them to become transit centers that also provides enhancement or rather enrichment activities for the children. We also provide a career development program for our carers who can come in as a babysitter, flexible, but of course we put them through our onboarding program, which includes training, certification, background check and things like that. But they could grow within the program in which we have implemented our Kiddo Care Academy, allowing them to work, gain experience, gain pay, at the same time learn and move along to become nannies, personal nannies, nannies for children with learning disabilities, educators, entrepreneurs, and things like that. So there are a lot more growth in that area, opportunities as well. But what's also a challenge for us is the regulation that may not support our new type of business and services. We're very lucky, Kido Care, in terms of highlighting the kind of need for new services and new business models, innovation led, because we're working a lot with UN Women, and under the Women Economic Principles, we're going around and getting companies to also recognize the need to support employees with this type of services, allowing them to benefit from flexible working, allowing them to focus on work while we have the carers taking care of their children at home. So they may not need full-time maids or nannies, but they will need some kind of an effective time at work. The collaboration that we have with UN Women also through AWEN has also allowed our women entrepreneurs to embrace a lot more technology in their businesses. By doing that, allowing them to have flexible working arrangements and giving a win-win situation in which they thrive better in their businesses, but also allows other women to come in and take care of their families. So yeah, those are, sharing a little bit of what we're doing and how the situation is in Malaysia and how we're working public sector and together with our funding partners, NGOs and CSOs, trying to raise funds for other women with more vulnerable situations. So we're also looking into parents who are striving or living with cancer and other types of illnesses and could not go out for work. And I think it's really, really crucial for us to bring in more impact investors at the moment and supporting social enterprises, cooperatives, because it's now, this is a time for us to build communities rather than individuals. So that's what I can say at the moment. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yusof. A very exciting social enterprise model over in Malaysia. And it's interesting to hear that women-led enterprises are faring better, possibly, as you say, because they are micro and small, they are more flexible to respond, but hopefully as well, they are having opportunities to respond to the needs, and Malaysia has brought forward some very progressive women-led business programs. I like that you have been promoting personalized and affordable childcare solutions. You seem to have been shaping the standards as well for the childcare sector in Malaysia. This is a very exciting initiative. I like that you ended off as well with the need for collective efforts and the collaborations that you already have internationally with organizations such as UN Women, but also your ASEAN network linkages. This is a very important area, and thank you very much for those comments. Now we have our final discussant, and last but certainly not least by any means, Ms. Kai Yiping. She is a Chinese feminist researcher and activist. She co-leads Dawn's sexual and reproductive health and rights activities. She participated in creating several vibrant women's NGOs in China after the 4th World Conference on Women held in Beijing. These included the Media Monitoring Network for Women and Network Research Center for Combating Domestic Violence. I'd like to hand over to Ms. Kai Yiping. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my great honor to have this opportunity to speak as the last speaker of this morning session. When I listened to the presentation, I also monitoring the text message in the chat box. So I'm multitasking, I think like every woman that's during the COVID have to dealing with. situation. So just response to both the chat box and the presentation, as well as the guiding question provided to us. So the crisis we experience now is, we had never had this experience before. It not begin with the financial sectors, not the economic, crisis. It's not even the political tension or catastrophe. It starts with health sector, and soon force the government take measure to contain the spread of virus, to put the whole economic in hunt, which we had never seen in human history. So when we review the section F, Women and Economy in the Beijing Platform Action, in the context of COVID-19, there's a need, urgent need, to reflect how the society has organized, operate, and regulates the economic activities, which largely has based on the extractivism and exploitation of nature of women, of workers. And this is the development model that leads to the glaring inequality and unsustainability. So this is the time to rethink how to distribute and redistribute the wealth, the work, especially the care work, as many speakers have mentioned, and the way to organize the production, the reproduction, including the biological reproduction and the social reproduction. So here is my reflection. I have three reflections to share with you. First, about care work and essential work. Those terms has become a buzzword in the past few months. Ironically, this is also the works that are crucial for survival and well-being of human society during the COVID, but it's also the work that has been long devalued. The data collected by ILO and other agencies and the research that's been done by the previous speakers has suggested that the women are concentrating in the sectors that are most affected by the COVID-19, or the most risky one that's exposed to the infection, such as health sectors, social service sectors, food production and processing industries, domestic workers, etc. Women are also comprise the majority of the informal sectors, which are not entitled to the benefit of compensation, paid leaves, or government support plan. How do the policies reflect this reality in order to not only build back better, but build forward towards equality, towards the justice? How to democratize decision-making to ensure the voice and experience of women and all the marginalized groups are considered and integrated into this process. So this is the one, I don't have answer, I have only the question, sorry. The second one is how we can monitoring and evaluate the measures that have been taken by many governments as a response to the pandemic, including investment to build more robust public health system, subsidize the social services, extend the social protection and security to the workers that previously excluded. Some of these measures are considered quite radical, which may not be the policy options, if there were no, incidents of the pandemic. For example, that's kind of universal basic income plan of some sort, economic support plans, economic stimulate plans, etc., etc. However, most of these measures are short-term and ad hoc as emergency response and support. As we know, the pandemic will not go away in the very near future in a couple of months. Therefore, the long-term and more comprehensive, systematic, coherent policies are desperately needed. So policy do not have to bounce back and forth between lockdown and reopening the economy, between dilemma of save lives or save jobs. Agencies, government, and civil societies are monitoring those economic measures, policies for their effect. Those policies monitoring is for the purpose of the, see whether it's effective, whether it's work. But I think it should be definitely monitored from the gender perspective, from the perspective of human rights and justice, equality and non-discrimination, as the previous speaker already mentioned. Even there's the financial support, there's a government plan, there's incentive plan, but women entrepreneurs do not have access to them and didn't get benefit from them. The last one, but not the least, in response to the guiding questions on what government can do to support women's economic empowerment. In addition to what the previous speaker have already mentioned, I would also like to invite us to revisit Beijing Plan for Action in the context of COVID-19, the strategic objectives outlined in the section F, which still have a long way to go to achieve, and now obstructed by the serious crisis, including this one. This, if we want to reach those strategic objectives, it will require the adequate on the long-withstanding investment and financial resources to strengthen the public sectors like health, education, sanitation, infrastructure, and improve the social production. They're often framed, those financial resources, when talking about this, public fundings, they always frame as the expenses rather than investment to increase the social capital. As we see in this pandemic, the societies that has already built a strong public sectors respond better and recover faster. It is time to revamp the economic, fiscal, and financial policies, tax policies to address inequality between countries, because as we see this developing countries as much more vulnerable and has mobilized not even able to mobilize the needed sources to cope with the crisis compared to the developed economies. So also, between the countries and also among different groups in the country, with still inequality is on rising, unfortunately, as we need to resilient to the new challenges escalated by the COVID-19. For example, emerging trends of platformation of economy, role of the gigantic fintech companies, the sectors that make amount of wealth and profit during the COVID-19. Based on the news, what I heard is that the richest person in the world, actually their wealth is increased dramatically. So the new form of the financialization of development, those are the phenomenon that we also need to look closely. Too much front to cover here within the 3 minutes. I can't cover all of them, but I want maybe pose these questions, maybe as a starting point. So when we are trying to interrogate those questions, we can ask who are taking the risks and who are making the profits? Where are the women? And where are those marginalized and deprived groups? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yiping. Very thought-provoking end off from the discussants, taking us back to the Beijing Plan for Action. I like that you have mentioned the investments and not an expense when we look at these very important infrastructures that have seen through some of the countries that have had better responses to the COVID crisis by having those public infrastructures in place. But you rightly point out that we are seeing more inequalities between the very rich and those who are becoming poorer. I'd like to end off quite quickly here because I understand we are running out of time and we want to get on to the next part of the session. Thanking very much our two discussants. We've heard now from our 4 panelists and our 2 discussants, and we'd like to move on to Q&A to get your comments and suggestions from the chat box. I hand over now to Shani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoni, and thank you to everyone who has been so actively participating in a very live box chat, taking place behind the scenes while the presentations were going on. We have a number of commentaries and questions. And so firstly on the commentaries, what we can say is that we will definitely take into consideration all of your views and comments and seek to include them to the greatest extent possible in the meeting report that will be coming out after this meeting. We had commentaries around the social protection mechanisms and how to extend it to healthcare workers and other workers in the informal economy who have been excluded to date, how to build awareness for women around gender responsive initiatives. And there was also a particular good conversation about the digital divide and sharing of information in this regard. So please do continue these conversations in the chat box. It is a nice new way for us to be conducting these meetings. Now, in addition, there was also a number of commentaries raised around the inclusion of vulnerable groups, women with disabilities, migrant workers, women migrant workers, and women farmers as well. And then there was a sharing of good practice. We heard from Jane Sloan on the Gender Voice Lab. I think information has been shared around that already to prevent gender-based violence, and also some possible propositions on how good practice around pro-Indigenous procurement policies might also be appropriated for pro-women procurement policies. And we had a commentary from the Cabinet Office of Japan on the ways in which they are integrating women's economic empowerment in their COVID-19 response. And so we thank you for all these commentaries. Now, with respect to the questions, there were a number of general ones and some to particular speakers. I will start with the ones for the particular speakers. Secretary Kativata from Nepal has three questions to answer from the floor. The first one is with respect to the 10 bill fund, whether any of these are earmarked for women and what the criteria are, what the eligibility criteria are. And we had also another question for Secretary Kativada on the Nepal Child Grant Benefit Support, and asking how social protection measures are being considered now in the context of COVID-19. And whether, the last question, there are any government plans for promoting the livelihood of women with disabilities. We also had a question from the floor from a participant in Kyrgyzstan who's asking Ms. Freiveld from UN Women, leading on the We Empower program, on whether there is any possibility to include other countries in Asian Pacific or to learn the model of the program that was presented. So these were the specific questions to speakers that we could summarize so far, and a number of general ones as well. Overarchingly, the questions was asked how and what should be the next steps to achieve the SDG 5 on gender equality in the Asia Pacific region. So this is a generalized question to all of the speakers, but also some very specific ones, such as whether you can comment on what can be done about the fact that governments are increasingly downgrading public sector employees so that they are not recognized as formal employees. And an example here was given of the accredited social health activists in India. We also had other questions around how you propose to ensure that all workers are recognized regardless of the sectors that they work in. And there are some good examples in this regard, as had been shared by Ms. Farida from Shirkatgah in Pakistan. And again, her second question relates to the social security scheme, how to make it increasingly robust if currently unregulated. And I think the last general question to speakers that I would mention here is on farmers. How can we apply the women economic framework to women farmers? And here some facts were mentioned that in many developing countries in Asia, women are constitute half of the farming population. But I think it's also worth reflecting on the questions that was raised by our discussants. And in particular, I wanted to just raise one by Ms. Chai Yiping on the monitoring efforts, how to make that increasingly systematic. And so over to you, Joni, live from the chat box.
So now I'd like to invite the esteemed Secretary, Government of Nepal, to respond. If you'd like to take the floor. Maybe you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Especially, I have got one question regarding this fund. As we have different types of fund, especially focusing for the COVID impact to activate the economic activities, and for the new entrepreneurs who really want to establish their new business. So we have one fund, 15 billion, that I got the questions whether it is for women or not. Yes, it is also for women too, but it's not only for women. And this is 15 billion, not 10. 50 billion funds, this is for the revival of their business who are already established, but they are suffering from COVID. So this is especially for the working capital and paying for their staff. So we have another fund. This 50 billion fund is just for established business who are suffering from COVID. And let me go to the another fund. We have another challenge fund. This is 500 million Nepali rupees. This is for everyone. That means the new entrepreneurs who wants to start their business with new ideas and innovation, they will get a loan with a concessional loan. It's only 2% interest rate. And for this, eligibility is just the project proposal. They don't have to need like a collateral or everything. Just they have a good project and innovative project, they can receive this loan. And third is the concessional loan fund. Again, we have this type of loan with 5% interest rate. This is also based on the project. And this is for new entrepreneurs and also the established entrepreneurs. This should be a bankable project. And if your project is convincing, you will get the loan with 5% of interest rate. And we have a separate fund only for women. That is especially for micro and small industries, micro cottage and small industries. This is, they will get 1.5 million rupees. It is with 6% of interest rate, and 1% will be rebate if they pay back it on time. And for this, they don't have to keep any collateral. Just they have to be recommended from some, the umbrella organization of some enterprises, like Federation of Industry and Commerce, or micro industry associations of the local level or the district level. So it also is very easy to get, but so one recommendation should be there. And other is the refinancing. This refinancing is a really good package that is almost 200 billion of fund, but it is based on hard-hit, mid-hit, and low-hit by the COVID. So there is no threshold for the the amount of the package, but it depends on your project and how much it has been affected. It depends. So I think I addressed this first question that is regarding the fund. So we have 5 types of fund. It is for new entrepreneurs and also for the established entrepreneurs. Thank you. So may I go to the second question?
Yes, please. Quickly, though. Thank you.
Sorry. It was so related to, so I received one question from Lakshmi, Nepal. Thank you for your questions, Lakshmiji. As you know, we have a 4 category for the disabilities, and A and B, you know, they are getting social securities allowances monthly. But as you say, we don't have any particular, you know, the program for C and D categories. But you were concerned about the livelihood program. Yes, we have some livelihood program, but we will carry on this type of program with coordination with other ministry and the local level. But if you come to us, or if you you know, make a call in my ministry, or if you come to and see our focal person, because we have a dedicated focal person for to deal with these disabilities, and we can facilitate for their livelihood program, because we have also allocated some, you know, the budget for livelihood program. So with other ministries and so basically with local level, we can facilitate. So please, I'd like to request you, if you stay in Kathmandu or where, I don't know, I think, or you can connect us in any way, or you can just email me, or you can just call to the Secretary's office. So we will discuss in the ministry and how can we facilitate you so with other ministry and the local level with our, I know, the dedicated budget. And regarding other social security program, yes, this ministry is really dealing with the safety net group, women, children, and just yesterday we marked the National Children's Day in Nepal, and so, we have you know, this dedicated the fund, we have allocated the fund, but so, local government is carry on everything regarding the social securities, but for children, our first priority, not only for children, the people within the safety net, our first priority is the protection approach. That means we rescue, relieve, and rehabilitate them, and we are working with closely with the different national and international non-governmental organizations and other stakeholders within the ministries, because even within the governmental organization, because it's very much cross-cutting. So, so the social security things in Nepal is dealing with Ministry of Home Affairs, and this is distributed by the local government. That means is related to federal ministry, federal affairs ministry. So we are coordinating and facilitating for this all social security things with other ministry. And so anyway, we are leading, and we are welcome to receive this, you know, the complaint and issues, and we will facilitate. So I would like to request Lakshmi ji once again, please contact the ministry.
So there's a wonderful moment for me to step in and say, it seems there's a lot of interest there, and we encourage you to reach out to Ms. Katiwada to get more information. We don't have a lot of time to cover our last questions. Thank you so much. Very, very, very much information to share. There are 2 more questions to address. The first one is to Katja Freewold from UN Women on the extension of We Empower Asia to new countries. And then there's a question for Ms. Guti Sudha on monitoring. So I'll hand over to both of them consecutively so we can be faster. Over to you, Katja, and then over to Sudha. Thank you.
Okay, quick and sharp. Unfortunately, We Empower Asia is for the time being limited to the countries I've mentioned. However, we are very much willing to share the principles and the learnings out of this in a wider sense. But I think another initiative on how to engage quickly and right now are the Women's Empowerment Principles, where UN Women is working across the region. So I've shared in the chat already some resources, and please reach out. This is something where we would love to work with any country in the region more closely together. Over to you, Sudha.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. So I'm not really answering this question, but there were these very important issues raised by Ms. Chai Yiping, and reflecting on some ideas really for discussion maybe over the course of tomorrow. There are several ways in which I think we can also enhance the transparency and hold governments accountable. And governments are taking the initiative to do so. For example, in Vietnam, the reason we are embarking on this impact of SME law in the country is precisely to look at, there have been several iterations and revisions of the SME law, and how does it really impact women entrepreneurs in different parts of Vietnam, North, Central, South, and what measures need to be taken for effective implementation. So through that example, what I'm trying to say is that it's not only important to include measures and policies and laws, but also look at how they're actually impacting women entrepreneurs across, or women, and it's an important angle to look at. In the context of COVID, one of the important aspects that has come up is governments are making tremendous efforts to provide support. But how accessible and easy is it for women to be able to have access to these services and also use them is another issue. So are there ways in which we can hold governments accountable in disseminating this information? For example, we're working with one of the governments in setting up a special portal with information related to COVID-related measures for women entrepreneurs. So are there more such initiatives in the region that can be shared and scaled up when it comes to increasing the transparency of how these measures are helpful? Just a few ideas, given the challenge of time right now, but we'll be happy to discuss more tomorrow as we progress with the meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you so much to our presenters and discussants. I would offer them a round of applause, or virtual, or thanks to everyone for this rich conversation. Thank you for being patient as well to extend a few minutes over. And with that, I will hand back to Shani to take us to the next step. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yoni, and thank you to all participants for attending this session on our virtual expert group meeting on implementing the Asia-Pacific Declaration in the COVID-19 context. Now, this concludes session 2 of the meeting and also the meeting for today. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. The meeting, as mentioned earlier, will begin half an hour before our meeting today at 9 o'clock Thailand Standard Time. Please do log in a bit in advance so that we can set up the technical tests once again. And we wish you a good afternoon, morning or evening, wherever you may be, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you very much.